This story begins with an introduction to the Republic of Aldemia's special elite force, the Ghost Squad. These guys are feared by soldiers and terrorist organizations all over the world. The Ghosts were the best special forces in the world. Among them was a man who was called the Strongest. He took part in many battles and distinguished himself in each one with his unrivaled skills. The man's name was George Sai. He was a tall man with black hair. Like a machine, he destroyed all his enemies. People trembled before him and reverently gave him various nicknames. One of them has become firmly established among the man's allies and enemies. George was called Mr. War. However, the events of July 6, 2025 changed everything. On this day, the strongest fighter George Sai will die in battle. On July 6, 2025, at 2:16 a.m., Special Forces began an operation to destroy the terrorist organization. The helicopter approached the building, but the wind was too strong and landing was impossible. The pilot said they would have to look for another landing point. The squad captain, a man named Beck, reported over the radio that it would no longer be possible to catch the enemy by surprise. The man understood that if they broke into the building, half of the squad would die, so they had to act according to plan and look for a landing point. At that moment, he saw George take out a rope and begin to throw it overboard the helicopter. Captain Beck tried to stop him, but the guy only said that they would have to meet at point B. Buck rushed towards George to intercept him, but it was too late. The pilot stopped the helicopter so that the landing would not be too hard. George descended alone into the enemy's lair. The guy landed and listened to the sounds. He was determined to catch the enemy off guard long enough for the rest of his squad to find a landing point. Captain Beck ran up to the pilot and asked if they could go back for the boy and was told no. Buck was angry with George for his wayward behavior, but there was nothing he could do about it. The man could only hope that the boy would not die before the squad joined him. Meanwhile, George had sprung into action and was about to enter the building. A flash of light appeared on the roof of the outbuilding to the left of the guy. The sniper on duty spotted the enemy and fired. George heard the shot and reacted instantly. The guy ran up to the statue and the bullet hit her in the head. The sniper continued firing but was unable to reach George. When the shooting stopped, the guy looked out from behind the statue and fired towards the sniper. All 3 shots hit their target, taking out the sniper. Unable to hold on to the wall, the enemy's body fell down. However, at that moment, an enemy approached George from behind. Hearing the click of the gun, George slowly turned his head. Seeing this, the terrorist ordered him not to move. George looked forward again and raised his hands up. The guy heard his opponent slowly pulling the trigger. The next second, George struck his opponent's arm with his elbow, thereby pushing the pistol away from himself. The guy hit his opponent in the legs with a spinning kick, knocking him down. The blow caused the terrorist to spin around and land right in George's arms. The guy applied a death grip to his opponent. With one easy movement, George snapped the terrorist's neck. At that moment, the sounds of an approaching detachment were heard. George turned and saw an enemy squad moving towards him. Without warning, they opened fire. George reacted instantly and picked up the body of the dead terrorist. He used it to protect himself from the shots. The guy raised his machine gun and said that he was clearly not welcome here. When the shots stopped, George let go of the body and grabbed the machine gun. He aimed straight at the leader of the enemy squad. The guy came closer to the column and started shooting. His bullets hit their target unerringly, and gradually the detachment began to thin out. Soon, every member of the squad was killed. Beck tried to contact George on the radio to find out if the guy was still alive. However, George turned off the radio without answering so that she would not draw attention to him. The guy headed straight into the building alone. Anyone who stood in George's way ended up killed. Meanwhile, things were unsettled at point B as the squad continued to wait for George to arrive, but he was not responding on the radio. Beck's adjutant reported that they were ready for the assault and would begin in a few seconds. The captain was concerned about George's behavior, who was always throwing himself into the thick of things. At that moment, the door of the building they were supposed to enter opened. Captain Beck put his worries aside and got ready to act. The entire squad prepared for battle and took aim. However, the next moment, Beck began to lower his machine gun. George came out of the building and announced that they could enter, as he had already cleared the building. Captain Beck breathed a sigh of relief, but the rest of the squad were not so pleased. All that was left for the squad was to collect the bodies of the terrorists to clear the area. Entering the courtyard, the detachment saw many bodies. They dragged all the dead into a pile. Each member of the squad was once again convinced that George was a real monster. Meanwhile, Captain Beck surveyed the area and decided to give George a dressing down. The captain grabbed the guy by the lapels and said that those who disobey orders have no place in his squad. George replied that it did not interfere with the completion of the mission, and thanks to his actions, no one was injured. Captain Back was only more irritated by the boys' behavior. At that moment, an adjutant approached them and announced that the commander was calling for Beck. The captain left George and said that the boy was always disobeying his orders, trying to stand out. George saluted and said that he could only repay the captain for his trust by killing enemies and completing combat missions. The guy said that he was in no way challenging Beck's authority, but was simply carrying out the tasks assigned to them. The captain understood this, but he couldn't help but worry about George. Beck sighed and said that one day his behavior would lead the guy to death. The captain approached the car and said that he was heading to headquarters, and that the detachment should work according to a pre-agreed plan. George watched the car leave and wondered what the plan was. The guy decided to check this with his colleagues and turned to face them. At that moment, all members of the squad pointed their weapons at him. The adjutant apologized to the guy with a smile on his face and said that this was the captain's order. The guy couldn't believe what he heard and began to retreat. He wanted to take the pistol out of the holster to try to fight back. However, the order was given and a bullet hit the guy's head. A huge number of bullets pierced George's body, throwing him towards the statue. Before his death, the only thought in the boy's head was whether Captain Beck had really ordered his death. George remembered his last conversation with the man and remembered him warning him that it would not end well. The image of a fair-haired girl named Sophia flashed before the boy's eyes, asking him to return alive. At first it became dark, but soon the guy began to hear strange sounds. Opening his eyes, he saw a dead man in front of him, who was right in front of his face. The boy smelled death and jumped up, throwing the body away from him. But soon he realized that he was in a whole mountain of half-decomposed corpses. The last thing the guy remembers is that he took part in an operation to destroy terrorists. However, George was distracted from his thoughts by the fact that the truck containing the corpses began dumping them into the sea. The guy still couldn't figure out where he was, but the possibility of falling into the water with the bodies didn't appeal to him. The corpses were dragging him along, not allowing him to grab onto anything. The guy was thrown outside the truck. At the last moment, George was able to grab hold of a rock ledge. The guy's face and hands were bandaged, but he still managed to save himself from falling. George pulled himself up onto his hands and looked down at the water. The guy stopped next to the truck and thought that he almost died. George had dealt with mountains of corpses before, but he had never seen such a degree of decomposition. Looking again at some of the corpses that remained on the rocks, he thought that they could have been the advance team from the Brazil region. From the open window of the truck, George heard the driver joking that they were just feeding the fish in Tokyo Bay. The guy jumped up immediately when he found out where he was. George removed the bandages that were bothering his face. The bandages were picked up by a cold wind and carried away from the shore. Now the view really did seem vaguely familiar to him. Japan was George's homeland, and now he is back. On July 6, 2025, George Sai died and was reborn on the island of Despair. In this incarnation, the guy was thin, with dark hair and bright blue eyes. George stood near the cliff and tried to figure out how he had been transported to Tokyo Bay if he was in the Middle East. The guy realized that he had only one lead. George turned toward the junkyard and watched the truck drive away. They brought him here in this truck, which means they know how he got there. For some time, the guy tried to catch up with the truck, but it moved further and further away. George followed the car all the way into the forest. The guy's strength was rapidly fading, and gradually the guy moved further and further away from the truck. Soon the car disappeared from view altogether. George stopped and tried to catch his breath from running. The boy had not yet realized that he had been reborn in another body, so the fatigue was strange to him. George looked himself over for damage, but at that moment his stomach growled. The guy thought that he should first get some water and food. After some time, George was able to find a hollow tree in which rainwater had accumulated. The guy climbed a tall tree to rest and look at the surroundings from above. George thought that what was happening to him now was similar to how he had fallen behind his comrades in the jungle. The guy's attention was drawn to a city near his vacation spot. However, from the outside, the town looked very strange. The streets were littered with trash, but people still scurried along the alleys between the old houses. George decided to go down and take a walk around the area. From the outside, the place reminded him of Tokyo Bay, but something was wrong with the people. The guy once again stepped on mountains of trash on the street. George was sure that there shouldn't be such slums in Japan. At some point, the guy's attention was drawn to something on the counter of one of the street vendors. George looked at the broken mirror and couldn't believe his eyes. From the shards of glass, completely unfamiliar bright blue eyes looked at him. The person in whose body he found himself was completely different from himself. My hands began to shake involuntarily from the shock I had experienced. Someone was calling out to a boy named Michio, but George didn't pay any attention until the stranger's hand touched his shoulder. The guy reacted instantly and turned around sharply. A short, dark-haired guy named Masa screamed in fear and tried to get through to his friend. George immediately realized that this guy was familiar with his new body, and even without a weapon, he would hardly attack. The guy let the stranger go and asked if they knew each other and what Masa wanted from him. Masa grabbed his throat and said that their mutual friend was looking for Michio. George realized that the boy did not wish him any harm, so he extended his hand and apologized for his actions. Masa accepted the helping hand and said that he was very glad that Michio was alive and well. The guy said that he was very worried about his friend, as he was constantly beaten. George helped the boy up and asked why he was being beaten all the time. Masa replied that in the mine, Zehu's word was law, but Michio opposed it. At that moment, a tall, heavy-set man approached them and asked if Masa had really just called Zeka disrespectful. The boy tried to justify himself, but the man was not going to listen to him. He only said that he had to teach a lesson to the slave miner who dared to treat him disrespectfully. It was Zehu himself who was going to punish Maz for his words. The guy got scared and tried to jump aside. However, he didn't succeed, and the next moment Zehu hit the guy in the jaw. The blow was so strong that Masa was thrown towards the counters. Zehu walked past George and said that everyone should have remembered the rules long ago. The man grabbed Maz by the hair and said that a mistake would result in punishment. Zehu said that he would have to answer for Masa making him angry. Masa started to fight back and said that it was not he who had treated Zek disrespectfully, but Michio. George still couldn't understand what was going on in this city, but the man in front of him was clearly not a good person. Hearing Masa's words, Zehu looked angrily towards Michio. Masa was no longer interested in the man and he moved towards Michio. Zehu said he was surprised that the boy survived the latest beating. George watched the man and his movements carefully. The man was not very pleased with the silence from his new victim. Even though this body was not prepared for a fight, it was not in George's nature to run away. Zehu flexed his fists and said that Michio had been beaten too little if he was still behaving like this. George still made no response to the man's threats. Zehu came up close and said that the guy would get his punishment at least for having too insolent an expression on his face. George's indifference irritated the man, and he attacked. The guy dodged and noted that Zehu had a wide swing. George immediately concluded that the man was just a rookie who was using his size to oppress smaller opponents. George said that he doesn't enjoy fighting with civilians, but if Zehu himself decided to attack, then he can't hold back. The guy was already starting to get annoyed by the man's constant words about how he would punish everyone. As Zehu was about to strike again, George crouched down slightly, moving under his opponent's arm. After this, the guy delivered one precise blow to the man's face. However, there was much less strength in this body, so Zehu only stepped back. It took the man some time to come to his senses. After this, it was clear that he had really lost his temper. George looked at his hand and realized that his new body was even weaker than he thought. However, the skills from his past life should have remained in his memory, so he rushed forward. Zehu jumped to his feet and lunged at him with a counterpunch, but George dodged again. The guy understood that even if he had little strength in his body, an elbow strike would be very effective. This should have been enough to neutralize the enemy. George ducked under Zek's arm and delivered one precise elbow to the face. The blow knocked out several of the man's teeth. George stood in front of Zehu, who had fallen to his knees, and said that with such skills he was no match for him. The guy said that a man can argue with him if he doesn't value his life. Zehu pressed his hand to his nose and looked angrily at the back of George as he left. Now this guy looked little like the Michio he had bullied. The man said he would not let this go unpunished and reached into his inside shirt pocket. Zehu took out a knife and said that anyone who dared to fight him would receive double punishment. After this, the man attacked George from behind with a knife. The guy was ready, as he expected a similar attack from the enemy. At that moment, George heard someone running towards him. The boy in shabby clothes pushed the guy aside to shield him from the knife blow. George looked at the boy in surprise, momentarily at a loss. Zehu had no intention of stopping, even after a child stood in his way. The boy closed his eyes and prepared for the blow. George had no intention of using the child as a shield, so he quickly pushed the boy back and approached Zek. The guy hit the man on the arm, pushing the knife aside and held him by the elbow. Seeing the expression on George's face, Zehu became scared. The guy said that since the man decided to take out a knife, It meant he was ready to fight to the death. This time, George wasn't going to let things go unpunished. The guy delivered one precise blow to Zek's throat, making him cough. George turned and tripped the man. Continuing to hold Zeha by the neck, the guy slammed the man into the ground. The boy couldn't believe that Michio had fought back against his bully and even won. For a few seconds, Zehu tried to come to his senses, loudly clearing his throat. However, this soon bothered the man little as George was looming over him again. The guy climbed on top of Zeha and was about to deliver the finishing blow. For a few moments, the man was speechless. Realizing the danger he was in, Zehu began to scream and ask George to stop. The guy didn't listen to him and only said that when life is at stake, there are no words about mercy. George delivered the final blow to the man's face. The boy gasped in shock as he watched what was happening. Now Michio's face didn't look like the person he used to know. Zehu lost consciousness from the force of the blow but did not die. George looked at his hand and was disappointed that the punch was weak, despite the fact that he had put all his body weight into it. The guy understood that with such a weak body, he definitely had to do something. A little boy watched what was happening from the side. He couldn't believe what was happening, so he was in a stupor for a while. However, after a few moments, he came to his senses and asked what was going on here. The boy called George by his new name, which made the guy understand that they knew each other. The guy turned to the boy and asked if they were close. The boy was angry at this and said that Michio was bullying him. George thought it would be better to tell everyone that he had amnesia. Hearing this, the boy became embarrassed. He said his name was Kay and he lived next door. George walked away from Zehu and apologized, saying that he didn't even remember the boy's name. Kay couldn't believe what he heard and didn't understand what to do next. He ran after George, asking if the guy was cheating on him. Meanwhile, Zehu managed to come to his senses, but he couldn't move, thinking only about the fact that he absolutely had to take revenge on Michio. George decided to take another walk around the town to take a closer look at everything, and Kay followed him. The boy jumped around George and asked him to teach him how to fight. The guy said that first Kay should tell him more about this island. The boy explained that the island they were on was an industrial waste dump drifting in Tokyo Bay. Kay said it was nothing more than a giant dump. George thought that he had never heard of such an island before, and could not believe that such a place actually existed in Japan. Kay continued and said that on the island, men are forced to work in the mines. Women and children, meanwhile, can only sell things or collect trash. Kay said that there are no police or anything like that in this place, since the island itself is like a cesspool. George thought it all reminded him of a slum in a conflict zone, or worse. Kay ran up to one of the counters where there was food. It was obvious that the boy was hungry, but he couldn't afford to buy anything. The man behind the counter ordered Kay to move away since he wouldn't be able to buy anything anyway. The boy flared up and said that a man should not rush to conclusions. At that moment, George put a bill on the counter and said that he needed bread. The man looked at the banknote doubtfully, but still gave the bread. George gave the bread to Kay and said it was his thanks for telling him about the island. The boy thanked his friend, but then he asked where the guy got the money. George said he took them from Zehu as a trophy, although he usually doesn't do that. Kay looked closely at the man he had known very well before. The boy said that now Michio seemed like a completely different person. Kay called the guy to his home and went ahead, showing the way. Approaching one of the old, dilapidated houses, Kay knocked and called his mother. The woman sat up in bed and looked at her son, who was carrying bread in his hands, saying that Michio would buy it for them. The woman smiled and thanked the guy, offering to eat together. Kay refused, citing the fact that he was already full, but his stomach growled at the wrong time. The woman stroked the boy's head, and he said that his mother should not worry about him and should eat. George watched this, not daring to disturb the family idol, but at some point he caught the smell of burning. The guy immediately realized that the source was very close and hurried out of the building. However, someone had already barricaded the door, and all the boy's attempts to get out were unsuccessful. Kay didn't understand what was happening and was concerned about his friend's behavior. George tried his best to knock down the door, but he was unable to do so. A few moments later, the room began to fill with smoke and fire. Only now did Kay understand the reason for Michio's behavior. The door of their house was barricaded by mine workers and set on fire. The order was given by none other than Zehu himself, who was standing nearby. Several other workers were armed with knives in case anyone managed to escape from the building. Zehu licked the knife with a crazy look and said that this was punishment for Michio daring to go against him. George tried his best to open the door, but he couldn't do it. The guy realized that it felt like there were about 8 or 9 people holding the door. George thought that even if they could leave the house, they would still die. The guy looked around the room to find something that would help them escape. He urgently needed to find something he could use as a weapon. There were many different things on the old table. One of these things caught the guy's attention. In the bag lying on the table, George saw the very thing he needed. Grabbing the bag, the guy ran to the door again. Kay didn't understand what exactly his friend was going to do, but he decided to stop him. The boy tried to find out from Michio about his intentions, but he never received an answer. A couple of seconds later, George reached the door and kicked it with all his might. At that moment, only 2 people were holding the door, and they were thrown to the side by the unexpected blow. The workers were already ready, and one could tell from their faces that they were acting not on orders, but of their own free will. Seeing the guy, Zehu laughed at him and gripped his knife tighter. The man ordered the workers to surround Michio from all sides. The workers immediately carried out Zehu's order and did not allow George to move away from the burning house. They were serious about killing the guy. George looked at Zeha and asked why he was following him again. The man smiled, thereby revealing several knocked-out teeth, and said that this was a matter of course. Zehu started talking about his favorite phrase about punishment again. The man said that the boy not only insulted him, but also harmed him, and for this, the maximum punishment is death. George looked at Zeha without a shadow of fear and said that in that case, he had no other choice. The guy said that he would definitely destroy Zeha this time. However, the man was completely confident that this time the guy would not be able to stand up to the huge crowd. At that moment, Kay and his mother were making their way out of the burning house. Near the threshold, they saw Michio, who had dropped to one knee and was bending over. George heard the sound of footsteps behind him and looked back. The boy told Kay to run away with his mother when the opportunity arose. The smoke made Kay's eyes water, or perhaps the boy understood the inevitability of Michio's fate. One of the workers heard George's words and rushed to the attack, saying that he would not allow anyone to pass. George picked up a bunch of small stones from the ground. He calmly waited for the moment when the enemy came close enough to him. George shifted the bag into his right hand and struck, moving slightly to the side. The blow landed on the opponent's head, causing him to fall to the ground. Kay stood frozen in place, watching Michio fight intently. After this blow, Zehu was no longer so confident in his abilities. The man couldn't understand how the guy could win without having a weapon. However, the worker lying unconscious on the ground left no doubt about the boy's abilities. George clutched the rope that held the bag tightly in his hand. The bag itself was filled with stones that he had collected from the ground some time ago. It was called Blackjack, a small bag filled with stones that served as a weapon. Thanks to the momentum of a pile of stones, it can deal massive damage. Despite the simplicity of the design, many mercenaries prefer such tools. George didn't wait for the next person to decide to approach him and rushed into battle himself. The workers reacted immediately and began an attack. George didn't need to use much physical strength to deliver powerful blows. Due to the centrifugal force when the bag was untwisted by the rope, a large force was created. A multitude of small stones impacted on each other, which made the impact even more powerful. It was one of the cheapest but most effective means of defense in an emergency. Zehu began to gradually retreat back when he realized that the guy was rapidly approaching him. George eliminated everyone who stood in his way. Soon there was no one left between him and Zehu, and they stood opposite each other. The guy said that now only Zehu was left. The man was speechless with horror and even began to beg the guy for mercy. Realizing that this time, too, requests would have no effect, Zehu rushed at George with a knife. The guy easily knocked the knife out of the man's hand with one blow of the bag. For a few moments, Zehu froze in place, after which he screamed loudly. The impact broke the bone in his hand, and now he could not hold anything in his hand at all. The knife fell to the ground, and the man continued to repeat that Michio was still too young to defeat him. George came closer to Zek, who fell to his knees, clutching his sore arm. All the man's thoughts were about the severe pain, and he forgot about the guy for a couple of moments. However, when he was very close, it was no longer possible to ignore his presence. The man looked up and saw Michio's eyes burning with anger. Forgetting his pride, Zehu began to beg for forgiveness and promised that there would be no more punishment. However, George did not give in to his persuasion and raised his hand with the bag, spinning it. The guy had already given Zek a chance to leave him alone once and already understood that he wouldn't leave him alone just like that. George apologized but said that any threat to his life must be eliminated. Zehu closed his eyes, expecting a blow to the head. At that moment, Kay grabbed George and begged him to stop. The boy said that there was no need to demonstrate one's strength like that, and that one should not kill a person no matter who he was. Kay said that if the guy does this, he will be no different from Zehu himself. The man took advantage of this pause and, jumping to his feet with wild screams, began to run away. George wasn't going to take his words back and began to spin the bag harder. He couldn't catch up with Zeha because Kay was clinging to him and refusing to let go. However, the guy could have thrown a bag at the man. For a couple of seconds, George took aim and spun the projectile harder. Adding all his strength to the throw, George threw the bag towards Zek. By inertia, the guy leaned forward, pulling Kay along with him. The bag flew at great speed towards the fleeing man. Zehu didn't see what was happening behind him, but he flinched from the loud crack. Turning back, he saw that the trunk of the tree into which the bag had landed had broken. George looked surprised that he missed. Zehu screamed louder than ever and tried to hide from sight, scaring the townspeople. When George no longer had the bag in his hands, Kay let go of him. The boy tried to catch his breath from the smoke and said that everything ended well. George did not share his joy because he understood perfectly well that despite his words, Zehu would never leave them alone. When the moon rose into the sky, Zehu arrived to see his boss. Their base was in a huge abandoned warehouse. Zehu fell to his knees in front of a tall, muscular man with blonde hair and said that Michio should be punished. Zehu said that the guy hit him and beat up all his people. The blonde man got up from the sofa and said that such behavior was unforgivable. Zehu was glad that his boss took his side, but his joy did not last long. The boss landed a strong blow to the man's face. Zehu didn't expect the blow, so he flew to the side like a limp doll. The boss said that he considered it unforgivable that the mine manager lost to an ordinary slave. The blonde put brass knuckles on his hand and said that he would first teach Zeka how to behave properly. Tears welled up in Zehu's eyes as he realized what would happen to him next. The boss dealt one blow after another until the victim stopped showing signs of life. Thick blood flowed from the man's hand and dripped onto the floor. The Doberman walked up to his owner and began licking the blood from his knuckles. The blonde raised his hand, clenching his fist tightly, and said that it was worth teaching Michio himself a couple of lessons. Kay's house burned down that night, and he and his mother no longer had a home. George found out from the boy where his house was and invited them and the woman to stay with him. The sick woman was laid on the only mattress, while the guys went about their business. Having finished laying out the surviving things, Kay went to the window and said that he had spent a lot of effort building that house. The boy was very upset that the house burned down in just a few minutes. The woman sat up on the mattress and asked Michio if he really didn't mind her staying with him. George said he didn't mind, but it was a deal, not a charity. The guy wanted the woman to tell him how power and food supplies were structured on the island. Kay couldn't stand this kind of behavior. The boy demanded that Michio not talk to them as if they were strangers to him. Kay remembered that the guy told him that he had lost his memory, but he acted like a completely different person, which did not fit with this legend. Hearing this, George shuddered because he really was a completely different person. The guy noted that Kay is indeed a very observant boy. George was once a soldier, but his life was cut short by the actions of his own comrades. Remembering his captain, the boy thought that it wasn't only Beck who was behind all of this. After some time of reflection, George was able to construct a bow from scrap materials. The guy planned to escape from this island as quickly as possible and take revenge on all the traitors involved in his death. Morning came, and George went outside to begin solving his main problem at the moment. His new body was very different from his previous one and did not have sufficient physical strength. George started the day with a vigorous workout. The body was unaccustomed to such stress and was shaking from the tension. The guy did a handstand to make the push-ups as difficult as possible. George bent his arms and sank almost to the ground. After putting in a lot of effort, the guy was finally able to straighten his arms and return to his starting position. He began to repeat the movements, but problems arose already on the second push-up. His body shook violently, letting him know that this was all he could do. George was distracted from his training by a familiar voice. Without dropping to the ground, the guy looked at the dark-haired guy running towards him. George sank to the ground and remembered that this guy's name was Masa. The guy also remembered that when Zehu approached them, Masa immediately shifted all the blame onto Michio in order to avoid punishment. The boy ran up to George and asked why he hadn't come to the mine yet. George thought this was a good opportunity to gather more information. After a while, the guy got ready and Masa accompanied him to the mine. Before starting work, the supervisor gathered the entire shift and ordered them to line up. The workers lined up in neat rows, but some of the men were beaten. George stood directly behind Maz to repeat after him if necessary. Feeling the burning gaze, George turned around and saw several battered miners looking at him with anger. The guy couldn't remember exactly, but he assumed that they were Zehu's henchmen whom he had beaten up the night before. The boss stood in front of the workers and demanded their attention. The man was about to say something about Zek, who was responsible for Group D, but he hesitated slightly. Unable to find the right words, the chief simply reported that Zehu was dead. These words shocked not only the man's henchmen, but everyone else as well. George thought about the fact that the last time he saw Zehu, he definitely did not leave him with fatal wounds. The boss said that now they need to appoint a new caretaker. The man pointed to Maz and said that he would now be in charge of the group. The guy was very shocked by this decision. After some time, the group began to carry out their duties. By talking and observing other workers, George learned that they worked in the mine from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. Because work had to be done deep underground, conditions were very difficult. Each worker was covered in a layer of soot and dirt that was almost impossible to wash off. The work was not made any easier by the fact that the boss was constantly walking around checking the work, scolding the workers without reason. One of the men was kicked in the stomach because his boss thought he was working too slowly. The worker could not respond to such an appeal and only endured the pain, gritting his teeth. Masa came up to him and put his hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down. The guy said that it was the same in all the groups, but the people watching there were real animals, and he would never become one. These words brought tears of joy to the worker's eyes, and he thanked Maz. The guy watched his group work and advised the workers to stop when they were already exhausted. George watched all this silently from the sidelines. At that moment, the mine manager approached them and asked what Masa was doing. The man pushed Maz aside and said he was too soft to be a caretaker. The boss approached the resting miner and said that he hated softies. The man asked the worker if he should be taught a lesson for this. At that moment, a pickaxe landed next to the chief's leg and hit him in the leg with one end. The man winced in pain and asked what was happening. He heard one of the workers apologize in a mocking tone. He turned around to see George, who said that his hand had only slipped. However, the guy's look said that he did it on purpose. The boss approached the guy and asked what his problem was. The man said that simply apologizing was not enough, so the guy needed to be reminded of what discipline was. At that moment, a loud male voice echoed through the mine. The boss shuddered and turned around in fear. The boss who had killed Zeha earlier was walking towards them. The blonde said that he liked the idea of a fight and would like to take part in it. All the workers flinched when Boss Kusanagi appeared. The mine manager was scared and said that he would never dare raise his hand against his boss. However, these frightened words angered the man. Kusanagi immediately rushed forward. The mine foreman tried to step aside, but the boss was much faster. Taking a swing at the man, Kusanagi said that those who do not listen to him must die. The next second, the man delivered one precise, powerful blow. The helmet immediately flew off the chief's head, and the man's body fell in a senseless heap to the ground. Everyone was shocked by what was happening and did not dare move. Masa was so frightened by Kusanagi's insane strength that he couldn't help but scream. Now George realized that he had come here not just to survive, but to fight back. Even though the mine boss wasn't a good man, his fear of Kusanagi meant that he was a scary man. The boss smiled and asked who wanted to fight him next. The man looked at George and asked if the boy was ready to fight him. The boy answered directly that he doesn't fight without a reason, which worried Masa, who tried to stop him by calling out Michio's name. Having learned the name of the guy who dared to answer him so brazenly, Kusanagi immediately realized that his main target was standing in front of him. The man rushed at George, saying that he was exactly the one he was looking for. The guy immediately took a defensive stance, preparing to defend himself. The rest of the mine workers retreated in fear, afraid of falling under Kusanagi's hot hand. The man, with an enthusiastic smile, began to deliver one blow after another. George gradually retreated back, unable to change the situation in his favor even for a second. Masa was very worried that at this rate Michio would be killed. A flurry of quick and accurate blows rained down on George. The new body felt heavy from every blow, but the guy tried to hold on. George noted that Kusanagi is truly a master of his craft. However, he was still able to see one weak point in the man. Like Zehu, the man has a flaw in his technique. His swing is too wide. George decided to take advantage of this, just like last time. When Kusanagi struck again, the boy suddenly ducked and stepped under his opponent's arm. The blonde noticed it immediately and looked a little surprised. A light lit up in George's eyes, and he thought that now the power was on his side. The guy delivered one precise blow to the opponent's face. All the miners were shocked by what they saw, because no one had been able to hit the Kusanagi before. Masa was on the verge of losing consciousness from shock. George froze in his position as if his target had not moved. The boy quickly looked up and met Kusanagi's face. The man smiled maliciously, squeezing the guy's fist, which had not hit him in the face. Kusanagi was impressed with George's skills and challenged him to beat each other unconscious. At that moment, a loud voice echoed through the mine like thunder, ordering them to stop. The mine workers looked as if death itself had decided to greet them personally that day. Even Kusanagi stopped and looked at the man who had arrived in surprise. All the mine workers at that moment fell to their knees, pressing their heads to the ground. The escort said that Director Akechi had arrived. A man in a long black coat walked along, accompanied by 2 senior miners. The workers bowed before him, forming a passage. The director adjusted his glasses that had slipped off his face. This man was the owner of the mine. George looked at Akechi and immediately realized that he was the one in charge here. The director ignored the boy who had not bowed and turned to Kusanagi. The blonde flinched at the man's address and turned his gaze to Akechi. The director said that Kusanagi could not hurt his workers just because he was itching to get his fists in. Akechi asked if the blonde wanted him to report all this to the marquise. Kusanagi shuddered at the mention of the chief. The man began to justify himself by saying that he was not crippling the miners, but had simply come to give them an edifying beating. Akechi passed by Kusanagi and said that a stupid person like him couldn't teach him anything. The man's words greatly angered the blonde, but he did not dare contradict him. Kusanagi tried to contain his anger by clenching his fists tightly. Akechi approached the miners, who were bowing low, and asked what they were doing. The man said he doesn't pay the workers to kiss the ground. Akechi said that they must dig every second they breathe. The director promised that otherwise they would all be buried right there. After a while, Akechi left, and at 2 p.m. a lunch break was announced. For food, ordinary miners received a portion of cold and tasteless rice. George sat surrounded by colleagues who were complaining about the meager food. Not far from them sat the keepers, eating their portions, which were more nutritious with gusto. Their containers contained rice, noodles, and even pieces of fried chicken. Ordinary workers called it the food of the gods and dreamed of trying it at least once. At that moment, someone approached George and handed him a portion of food for the keepers. It was Masa, and he insisted that the guy take his portion. George looked doubtfully at the food, which was enticing him with its aroma. However, the guy still refused the offer and returned to his portion. George said he refused because he didn't like being in debt. Masa sat down next to the guy and said that it wasn't about the debt at all. The guy said it was payback for that time he got George into trouble. Masa sincerely regretted that he had let his friend down in front of Zehu that day. The guy said that he couldn't just let it go, and that he should at least pay for the deed by giving up his lunch. George looked at Maz carefully to see if he was being sincere. Soon, a slight smile appeared on the guy's face. George took a piece of chicken from the guy's container and said 1 piece for 1 lie. The guy said that it would be fair, but he couldn't help but note that the chicken turned out to be very tasty. George said that now they were even and Masa should eat the rest himself. While Masa could not believe that his friend had actually refused food, other workers approached him from behind. They pounced on the guy, simultaneously pushing each other away from the desired food. Masa tried to stop them and promised that he would give each of them a piece. At that moment, one of the guards approached their group and asked the guys how much longer they were going to sit there. The man ordered the group to get up immediately and get to work. Slave miners are forced to work almost non-stop. They had no rights as people, which often led to dire consequences. While working, one of the workers fell to the ground from exhaustion. Masa saw this immediately and ran to the man to help. The guy tried to bring the worker to his senses, but the supervisor ordered him to step aside. Masa looked at the man doubtfully, but he couldn't resist. As soon as he pulled away from the worker, the overseer kicked the body, turning it face up. The man sat down next to the worker and placed his fingers on his neck, checking his pulse. A few seconds later, the guard clicked his tongue in irritation and said that the man was dead. Masa couldn't believe what he heard and took a couple of steps back. The warden turned to Group A and ordered them to throw out the body immediately, as it was from their team. Trembling with fear and despair, Masa volunteered to carry the man's body out of the mine. Before leaving, Masa, with tears in his eyes, asked Michio not to overexert himself. George watched quietly as it happened and realized that this was truly a terrible place. Here, people were forced to continue working even after the death of one of the miners. Even a funeral in this place was not a reason not to work. People became so exhausted from poor food and hard work that they fell dead. There was no respect even for the bodies, as they were simply thrown away. In this place, even human life was worth nothing. George looked at the helmet that remained from the dead miner. The guy understood that he couldn't leave all this unpunished. When the clock struck 11, working hours were over and the boss rang the bell. People continued to work until the very end and did not sit down even once after lunch. The boss ordered the workers to lower the tool. Maz's legs were shaking from a hard day's work, and he was incredibly glad that they were done for the day. The guy looked at George in surprise and couldn't understand how he could still stand on his feet. George took off his helmet and said that he was already used to such loads. Masa couldn't remember Michio being this strong before. At that moment, the shift supervisor approached them and rang the bell, ordering them to hurry. Masa became alarmed and said that they were already on their way. At the end of their shift, all slave miners are forced to undress. In an exhausted state, the workers must go out naked. The shift supervisor controlled all processes so that no one would even dare to think about taking anything out of the mine. Climbing out of the mine after a 16-hour shift was very difficult, but they were constantly urged on. Each worker was thoroughly searched to prevent theft of ore. Everyone was searched to the maximum extent, as if they were in prison. Only after this were they allowed to return to the surface. On leaving the mine, they were allowed to dress and ordered to line up in rows. The boss called each slave in turn by number and handed out their wages for the day. When it was George's turn, he saw that for such hard work they were only paid 1,000 yen a day. The guy stepped aside and put the bill in his pocket. Behind him, George heard one of the workers accept the money with great gratitude. The man lovingly rubbed himself against the banknote and said that it made him happy. George didn't understand how a man could be happy with that amount of money. A few moments later, all the workers heard the sound of wheels. Smiles broke out on the faces of many miners. George felt something was coming, but he couldn't figure out whether it was good or bad. Almost all the workers shouted joyfully, anticipating the appearance of the unknown. They started salivating with anticipation. Soon, a mobile snack stand appeared in front of them. The woman in uniform said with a smile that the men had done a good job and now it was time for a smile sale. The girl at the kiosk said that today was Miners' Thanksgiving Day, so there was a 20% discount on all goods. George realized that there was nothing dangerous about it and relaxed. At that moment, all the miners ran past him towards the chute with joyful smiles on their faces. The first miner spends 320 yen to buy beer and a small bag of chips. The woman gave him another pack of squid for working hard today. The men, as if possessed, climbed to the stall and wanted to buy beer and snacks, thereby spending the money that they had earned so hard today. They saw no other joy in life than spending all their money on one bottle of beer and a couple of snacks. They drank and enjoyed the intoxicating taste. One of the workers took a few sips and said he felt happiness in every cell of his body. Another man said they didn't understand anything, because saving on Thanksgiving Day was the height of inefficiency. He said he was going all in and quickly began to devour the beer and snacks. That evening, he spent all the money he earned. George looked at what was happening in shock. They had just been treated like slaves, and suddenly this drastic change happened. Masa didn't buy anything and stood next to George, watching with envy as his colleagues greedily devoured their food. George asked why the guy didn't buy anything for himself. Masa wiped away his drool and said that he also wanted to buy something for himself, but he couldn't. The guy swore to himself that he would not buy anything until he got a pass to Paraiso. George asked what the pass was for, and Masa immediately remembered that the guy had amnesia. The guy said that they were told about this as soon as they arrived on this island. That day, the owner of the island gathered them and said that from that day on, they would be slaves crawling in the mud. They were given just enough food to keep them from starving and forced to work to the limit of their abilities. That day, they were told that they could get out of here if they saved up 1,000,000 yen. They were shown the Paraiso Pass and told that it was their key to freedom. Having learned about this opportunity, everyone was incredibly happy, and all who arrived were confident that they would definitely be able to save up. But that was before they learned what was really going on the island and what the salaries were like. Now the people who were shouting the loudest about saving were mindlessly spending the money on beer and snacks. Masa looked at them from the side and told his friend that he had decided to run away from here so he couldn't buy anything. The guy was determined. Masa said he wouldn't pay attention to how much he was kicked. Even if he collapses from exhaustion, he will save every yen to get off this island. Now George understood why even in such a hell there was no rebellion from people. A carrot is constantly dangled in front of the slaves' noses, which encourages them to work. And this carrot is the hope for salvation. The second carrot was the pleasures that people were lured to with the help of trays with alcohol and snacks. Lost in the momentary pleasure, the slaves forgot about the hope of salvation and remained on the island much longer than they had originally planned. The guards standing above them understood this perfectly well and therefore encouraged their desires. They intimidated people, leading them to the desire to forget about the hardships of life. After this, a saving remedy for fatigue and fear arrived, and people took it without hesitation. George was sickened by this kind of duplicity. The guy took the money he had earned today out of his pocket. George approached Masa and asked how much he had left to save before he got his pass to Paraíso. The guy was afraid that his friend might be interested in this in order to rob him. George leaned over to the boy and reassured him, saying that he wouldn't tell anyone about it. The guy handed Maz a bill and said that he just wanted to help him save up. George said that he would help the boy escape from here. While all the other miners were enjoying their snacks, two guys stepped aside. Masa told George that he still had 60,000 yen to save. George said that with his salary he would get 2,000 a day, and thanks to this, the guy would be able to save up the amount in a month. Masa was glad of such help, but did not understand why his friend was trying so hard for him. George walked up to the cliff and said he was doing all this for himself. The guy looked at the sea and asked if there was a pier and boats on the island. Masa said that they didn't have anything like that and pointed somewhere down. George spent a long time trying to understand what exactly the guy was talking about. However, he didn't see anything special. After some time, Masa said that the entire island was surrounded by steep cliffs, so there were no piers here. George said that he would go downstairs, and the guy should keep watch upstairs in the meantime. Masa got scared and said that escaping from the island was prohibited. George continued to descend, saying that he didn't know there were laws on this island with 0 laws. A few moments later, the guy heard a familiar sound. George immediately began looking around to find the source of the sound. A military drone was flying towards him from the sea. The drone had a weapon attached to it, and it was clearly aimed at George. The guy froze in place because he didn't expect this. The drone reported that the target had been acquired, which prompted George to quickly climb up. Masa stood frightened at the top and did not understand what was happening. Very quickly, George was back up and the drone took off with him. George saw the frozen guy and shouted at him to run. Masa did not understand such panic on the part of his friend and was in no hurry to carry out his order. At that moment, a bullet flew past the guy's head and scratched his cheek. Blood began to slowly flow down Maz's cheek, who was still in shock and afraid to even move. The drone opened fire again and began flying towards the boys. This time, Masa rushed towards the forest faster than George. The drone continued firing, pursuing the boys. The bullets miraculously missed the boys, even though they flew a few centimeters away from them. Masa couldn't stop screaming in fear every time a bullet flew especially close to him. The bullets were still running out, and the boys began to think that they would die here. They soon ran into the forest, where it would be more difficult for the drone to get through. Continuing to run, George turned around to look at the drone again. Now the guy was completely sure that he already knew this drone model. George remembered that this model, once it locks onto a target it considers a threat, will pursue it to the end. The troops gave this drone a nickname, Mad Hunter, Crazy Pursuer. The guy knew that even the most seasoned soldiers shuddered at the mention of this drone. Gradually, Masa began to fall behind and asked why the drone continued to follow them. George ignored his questions and tried hard to come up with a plan of action. Something to the side caught the guy's attention. George stopped abruptly and darted to the right, telling them to run after him. Masa was confused and said that they were approaching a dead end. George told the boy to shut up and just follow him. Making their way through the thickets, they managed to get a little distance from the drone. However, the Mad Hunter was able to fly around the overgrown area and began to look for his target again. Soon he had his target in his sights again. To make it easier to navigate through the nearby trees, the drone turned vertically. George looked at him and realized that they really couldn't tear themselves away from him. The boy continued to move forward, leading Masa behind him. At some point, he noticed that the guy was falling too far behind and told him to hurry up. However, Maz did not have such endurance, so he said that he no longer had the strength to run. George knew that if things continued like this, they would definitely be shot. The guy saw a big rat on a tree nearby. A plan immediately formed in his head. George sped up to reach the rodent before it ran away. The boy grabbed the rat and told Masa that he was starting the countdown. George said that at the end they would have to stop and not move. Masa didn't understand what the guy was going to do and said that in that case they would be shot. However, George did not listen to him and started counting down. Masa turned blue with fear and begged the guy to stop and think again. The drone continued to pursue them, and when it got close enough, it opened fire again. Masa covered his head with his hands and continued running after his friend. The drone didn't lag behind the guys for a second. George continued counting and trying to find the best spot. After a few moments, the guy had almost finished counting. Masa cried from despair, but decided to follow his friend's words. George looked at the rat in his hand and mentally apologized to it. Having finished counting, the guy threw the rat towards the drone. It definitely hit the drone's camera, knocking it off course a little. The camera began to rotate in different directions, searching for its target. Soon she locked onto the target and began beeping. The drone reported that a new target had been spotted. The new target was a rat that George had recently thrown at the drone. The Mad Hunter immediately notified of the start of the object's destruction. The drone killed the rat with a few shots. After that, he began scanning the area again for another target. George closed his eyes and tried to remain still so as not to be noticed. Masa followed the boy's advice and also did not move. The drone began to slowly fly towards them, rotating its camera in different directions. The guys froze and tried not to even breathe. The drone flew calmly over their heads. After a few moments, he began to circle above them, as if trying to find something hidden in plain sight. The camera kept turning to George and then back to Maz, but never gave a detection signal. The drone flew especially close to Masa, who began to tremble slightly. The camera moved close to the guy's head and pointed a gun at him. A few moments later, the drone turned around and the camera turned to George. The gun was also pointed at his head and there was a click. George understood that this was their only chance to survive, so they had to stand to the last. The drone froze in the air for a while and then began to beep. A drop of sweat slowly rolled down the guy's face and threatened to fall off his chin. Soon she fell, however, breaking into pieces on a sprout on the ground. The drone turned again and began to gain altitude. The new target was not acquired, so the drone's work was completed here. The boys remained motionless until the Mad Hunter was completely out of sight. Soon, the drone signaled that the target's elimination had been completed. As soon as the drone disappeared from sight, Masa fell to the ground from exhaustion. The boy couldn't hold back the flow of tears and said that he thought that it would be the end for them. George breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that not many had ever encountered a rabbit hunter and survived. Masa asked the guy what just happened. George shook the boy's hand and said that it was a drone developed in the Republic of Aldimia. It was created solely for surveillance and destruction. George said that this drone has no concept of friend or foe. For him, everyone is an enemy. It is because of this defect that they stopped using and producing it long ago. Masa was very surprised and asked how the guy even knew about this. George didn't answer this question. He was only thinking about how the Mad Hunter ended up on this island in the first place. This model was so dangerous that it was banned from sale to other countries. This island was indeed very strange. George could only guess how he might be connected to the Aldimian army he had once served in. When the boys caught their breath after the chase, they were finally able to reach their homes. George returned to his shack, where Kay and his mother were waiting for him. The boy entered the house, where he was greeted by warmth and the smell of food. Kay stood next to the fire and cooked soup. The boy said that the guy was very late, and his mother corrected him, saying that they should say hello first. George came closer to the fire and asked what Kay was cooking. The boy rolled his eyes and said he was making leftover stew and the guy would remember it when he tried it. Kay poured the stew into a bowl and said it was made from prime leftovers thanks to George. The guy tried not to grimace as he looked at the prepared food. A couple of minutes later, the three of them sat down at the table and prepared for a late dinner. Kay sniffed the stew and said it smelled delicious. George cautiously took a spoonful to try it. The dish tasted terrible, making him doubt that it was even meant for human consumption. However, Kay was delighted and devoured his portion with gusto. George didn't understand why the boy reacted that way to such nastiness. The guy leaned over to the boy's mother and asked why he was acting like that. The woman said that on this island, even saying hello is quite difficult to learn, and the boy had lived here since early childhood. He had eaten things much worse in his entire life, so the stew made from the leftovers made him very happy. The woman recalled that he once had to eat noodles with worms, so the disgusting food was familiar to the boy. It was clear that the woman was very upset by this, so George did not comment on it. At that moment, Kay found a shrimp tail in the stew and was very happy that he had come across a piece of meat. The boy ate his portion with great pleasure. Soon he said that he had eaten his fill. After this, Kay extended his hand to George and said that he had to give him something. The guy frowned and asked what the boy expected from him. Kay frowned and said that George should pay for the food with the money he received today. The guy calmly finished his portion and said that he had already given all the money he had earned to Maz. Kay was shocked by his words. George said he plans to continue supporting Maz and giving him money. The boy was very angry and jumped to his feet, dropping the plate of food. Kay shouted that it was all Michio's fault, but the boy didn't pay attention to him. The boy sat down on his knees next to the plate and began to shake with resentment. George finished his food and put the empty plate on the table. The guy said that everything he does has a useful meaning. George told Kay to gather up the remains of the food and follow him. The boy did not understand the guy's intentions, but still decided to follow him. Soon they came to the forest. George took the basket with him and took the spoiled portion of stew from Kay. They stopped in a small clearing, and the boy asked what the guy was going to do with the stew. George poured the food on the ground and said that's what he was going to do. Kay was furious that the guy had thrown away his food. George stuck the stick in next to him and said that he hadn't thrown it away but had recycled it. The boy took the basket and leaned it against the stick at an angle. George said that even the strongly smelling remains, if dried, would work well as fertilizer. Thanks to this, it is possible to grow quite strong agricultural crops. When Kay saw what George had built, he immediately realized that they were going to hunt mice and small animals. The boy said that he had only heard about eating mice, but had never dared to do it himself. George said that over time you get used to everything, and rats are a breeding ground for diseases only in the city. The guy said that wood mice are a valuable source of protein, so you shouldn't give them up. George walked further into the forest, and Kay thought they were going to set a trap again. However, the guy didn't respond to this. Stopping in the bushes, Kay asked if it was necessary to set a trap in such a remote place. George replied that this was necessary because in the forest the animals felt calm and came closer. Soon, Kay noticed what the boy had been looking at for so long. Ahead, on a tree branch, sat a small bird, which was reaching for a caterpillar and was caught in a trap. This is exactly what George was going to show him. The bird fluttered, but the rope was tightly wrapped around its neck. George asked if that would be enough to pay for the stew. Kay beamed with happiness and said that this was more than enough. We are transported to the mine's administrative building. The mine managers submitted their reports to Director Akechi. Overseers reported that 9 slaves died in 1 week, with exhaustion or overwork being the main cause of death. Deputy Director Eugene said that the slaves were just like people, so they should increase their food portions and give them time for breaks. The director only smiled at these words. He tossed the papers up and said that the word life was not on the list of criteria for evaluating the head office. The deputy tried to insist, but Akechi ordered him to stop bothering him. The man said that if production volumes increased, his assessment would improve, and a promotion to head office would not be long in coming. Akechi said that he didn't want to sit on this damned island forever. The man said it didn't matter how many slaves died extracting these resources. For a few moments, the office fell silent, after which the deputy gave in. The director ordered to continue with the countdown. Another mine supervisor stepped forward and reported that the payroll recovery rate was around 90%. The man said that the slaves had behaved as usual this week too. As soon as they received the money, they spent almost all of it right at the exit of the mine. The guards openly laughed at the slaves' stupidity. Akechi said that slaves are just cattle that go for carrots. The director asked if there was any other news. One of the guards said that one guy from the 8th group was saving up for a pass. These words caused laughter among the other guards because they could not believe it. Akechi, however, took this situation more seriously, since one guy from this group had already caught his attention. The next day, Masa came to Michio's house to go to work together. George answered the knock on the door, but his voice came from somewhere behind the house. Masa thought this was strange, so he carefully peered around the corner of the house. Seeing what his friend was doing, the guy perked up. George tied the cloth to a protruding rebar on the roof of the house and pulled himself up with one arm. Masa watched what was happening for a few moments, not understanding anything. George looked up from his exercises and asked why the boy had come to see him. Masa said that he planned to go to work with the guy, after which he asked what his friend was doing. George jumped to the ground and said that his body was too weak, so it needed to be strengthened. The guy said that he has one goal that he strives for with all his might. Rubbing his wrist, George said he needed to develop his physical fitness to move forward. Masa chuckled and said that the guy was very strange, and between training and work, he had to choose the latter. At that moment, Kay came out of the house and asked why they were making noise since early morning. Seeing Masa near the house, the boy became a little scared and asked who he was. The brunette turned to Kay and introduced himself, saying that he worked with Michio. The boy immediately perked up, realizing that it was this guy to whom George had given his salary. Kay held out his hand and demanded the money he was going to use to buy food. The boy grabbed his stomach with his hand and said that they constantly didn't have enough money for food. Masa froze in place, as the image of his little sister seemed to come to life before his eyes. The boy recalled that the girl also held her stomach and constantly complained that she was hungry. Back then, although they were not yet well off, they could afford to buy normal food. Masa often cooked for his sister, and every time the girl was pleased and gave her brother a radiant smile. A slight smile couldn't help but appear on the boy's face at the memory of his younger sister. Masa squatted down and apologized sincerely to Kei. The guy promised that next time he would definitely bring something tasty, so the boy shouldn't be angry with him. Kei looked away, but agreed to this condition, asking to bring something worth 1,000 yen. It seemed as if Masa had found in the boy what he had been missing for a long time, and Kei did not feel threatened by the boy and was unconsciously drawn to him. While the guys were talking, George finished his workout and put on his sweatshirt. After some time, George and Masa started their shift in the mine. Masa kept a close eye on his team while he worked. It was this that allowed him to notice that one of his charges, named Hao, was completely exhausted and was having difficulty carrying the stones. Masa immediately shouted to a worker named Isaiah to help him. Isaiah immediately reacted and ran to his colleague so that the two of them could drag the stones to the right place. The workers divided the load between them to make it lighter. At that moment, Director Akechi's voice was heard, saying that Masa had excellent leadership qualities. However, these words made Masa afraid. The director approached the guy and said that Masa constantly monitors safety, and this is very commendable. The guy took off his helmet and asked if Akechi really knew him. The director took a couple more steps forward and said that his people had told him about the guy. Akechi said reports indicate Masa is managed without violence and is improving productivity. Stopping in front of the guy, the man said that the rumors were true. Masa was delighted that they had come to praise him, which brought a smile to his face. The boy bowed low to the director and said that it was a great honor for him to hear such words. Akechi smiled and said that Masa could relax. The man said he had come to give the boy a special award for his efforts. Akechi said that when a person has a goal, his motivation also increases. George was wary of the director's visit and words, but did not enter into conversation. A few moments later, Akechi said loudly that presenting the award in front of everyone was very dangerous. The man said that people are very envious by nature and can say all sorts of things. Akechi called Masa to follow him so they could talk in a safe place. Before going to get the director, the boy approached George and asked if he could get a pass. George said he had a bad feeling about this, so Masa should be on guard. Masa said that maybe he was exaggerating, but it seemed to him that the director was not as bad a person as they said about him. After that, the boy ran after Akechi and his team, waving goodbye. George watched Maz go, but the situation made him nervous. Before following the director, Kusanagi asked George if he was worried about his friend. The blonde said that they were going to throw a small house party for the guy now. These words made George convinced that the director had not come for Maz with good intentions. After some time, Masa brought Akechi and his men to his house. The guy wanted to proudly present his house and honestly said that this room was not worthy of such guests. Akechi said that it was okay, as the enclosed space would be even better for them. The guy calmed down and invited the guests to come into his house. Masa suggested that they settle in while he prepared some tea. The guy kept smiling, because he believed that they had come to him with pure motives and would not judge him. However, his expectations soon collapsed like a house of cards. Akechi covered his nose with his hand and said that this room was even dirtier than he expected, so the unpleasant smell made his nose hurt. Masa froze in place, not understanding such a sudden change in the director's mood. The next moment, Akechi ordered his men to search the entire room. Several of his subordinates immediately began turning the house upside down. Masa looked at them in shock and did not understand what was happening. He was distracted by the people searching the room and didn't notice at all that Kusanagi approached him to hit him. The blow landed in the stomach, causing Masa to fall to the ground and start spitting out bile. Before the boy could recover from the blow, one of Akechi's men sat on top of him. The man twisted his arms behind his back, pinning him to the ground. Another person started searching the guy himself to find something. Akechi interrupted Masa's screams and said that he knew the boy was going to buy a pass. Only now did Masa realize that the director and his men had come to his house to take his money. Without waiting for an answer to his questions, Akechi grabbed the boy by the hair and said that he hated waiting. The director said that if Masa spoke right now, he would only lose money. The guy couldn't believe that all of Akechi's words were lies, and that there really was no path to freedom. The director just laughed at Maz's naivety and said that slaves really were as stupid as animals. The guy didn't understand why the man was treating him so cruelly because he had done nothing wrong. Akechi's patience ran out and he said that Masa was just wasting his time. The director hit the boy's head on the ground. Rising from the ground, Akechi straightened his coat and ordered the tools to be brought. A few moments later, one of the subordinates took out a pair of pliers. Masa looked at the instrument with horror and did not understand how it could be useful. However, all his questions disappeared when Akechi's subordinate grabbed him by the hair, lifting his head and grabbed one of his teeth with pliers. Masa screamed in horror and began to beg the man to stop. The force with which the man squeezed the pliers caused the tooth to crack. Akechi watched what was happening with delight. The subordinate jerked his hand sharply, pulling out Masa's tooth. The guy screamed in pain at the top of his lungs, and the capillaries in his eyes burst. Akechi said that he warned Masa about what he should have said earlier. The man reminded him that if the boy had given up, he would only have lost money. The director ordered his men to continue until Masa told where he had hidden the money. Time passed, and the shift in the mine was already over, and the workers were resting outside. George looked around and realized that Masa had not returned. The workers naively believed that the boy was being showered with gifts and envied him. George had a different opinion, but he wasn't going to express it. The guy noticed a man coming out of the mine who had come into the mine with the director. It was Deputy Director Eugene. George walked up to the man and asked him point blank where Masa was. Eugene did not expect that they would approach him with questions, and he shuddered. It was clear that the man was hiding something, but he replied that he knew nothing. George immediately realized that Eugene was prevaricating and asked what they were up to. The man realized that he wouldn't be able to hide the truth, but he didn't intend to speak openly either. Eugene said that it would be better for the guy not to get involved in this matter. Otherwise, he would regret it. The man clenched his fists and said that George should think about how to get home himself and not worry about others. These words confirmed that nothing good would come from Masa's meeting with the director. Meanwhile, the torture in Maz's house continued. The subordinates mercilessly pulled out the boy's teeth and did not react to his heartbreaking screams. Masa had already lost half of his teeth, but he continued to keep silent about the money he had saved for a path to freedom. For a while, the torturers stopped, as they themselves were running out of patience. Akechi said that at this rate, the guy would have nothing to eat, so he should tell them everything as quickly as possible. Masa pressed his forehead to the ground and said that he knew nothing and that he had no money. Akechi grinned maliciously and said that he didn't believe a single word and would personally help refresh his memory. The director's subordinate grabbed Maz by the face and held the pliers with the extracted tooth towards him. The guy couldn't understand what the man was going to do with him this time. He looked at his tooth, which was being brought closer and closer to his mouth. The next moment, the man sank the tooth back into the boy's gum. Akechi smiled and said that the tooth was back in place and that it was so wonderful. The director ordered his man to repeat this procedure. Now the guy's teeth were first pulled out and then they were put back in. Akechi watched the scene with a crazy smile and clapped his hands. The house was filled with terrible cries of pain. These screams brought pleasure to the torturers. Masa was choked by his screams and tears, but remained silent. It was clear that the torturers were enjoying the process and had most likely even forgotten about the main reason for the torture. Akechi's eyes turned red from the emotions that filled him. After some time, the torturers stopped, and Masa spat the teeth out of his mouth. Akechi smiled and asked if the boy remembered that he had savings. Masa lay on the ground and groaned in pain, but his little sister's voice was clearly heard in his head. The guy thought that he would never give back the money he had saved. He had a reason to get out of here, and he would never give up. Masa recalled how his sister became seriously ill and needed to undergo surgery. The girl apologized to her brother for the fact that the operation was very expensive. Masa then replied that there was no need to worry because he had found a great job and would be able to pay for everything. The guy promised that he would earn a lot of money, bring his sister lots of gifts, and never leave her again. The thought that he was forced to leave his sister for a long time did not give him peace, so he could not give the money with which he could buy freedom. Akechi saw Masa's angry look, and it made him angry. The director asked how dare he look at him like that. Akechi said that for this they could pull out all his teeth. Masa tried to justify himself and said that he didn't have any money, so he couldn't give them anything. Akechi understood that this was not so, but he no longer knew how to make the guy talk. At that moment, Kusanagi walked past him, looking determined. The blonde hit the man sitting in front of Masa in the back to make room for himself. Akechi became scared and asked what Kusanagi was doing. The blonde said that Masa would never speak with such methods. The director still couldn't understand what the guy was going to do in this case. Kusanagi pushed aside all his colleagues and lifted Masa by the collar of his shirt. Looking at the tortured boy's face with an ominous smile, Kusanagi said that he shouldn't overestimate himself. After this, the blonde moved his hand to the side and clenched his fist. Masa saw this and immediately understood what would happen next, but it was impossible to prepare for it. Kusanagi hit the guy in the stomach with all his might, causing him to immediately start spitting bile. Several ribs could be heard breaking. Looking at Masa, Kusanagi said that the boy only endured all this because he didn't lie to them. Masa fell to his knees and groaned in pain, pressing his hand to his stomach. Kusanagi licked the blood from his fist and said that now he enjoyed hitting the guy. Masa saw in front of him a guy whose strength was capable of breaking bones with one blow. The cruelty that finds joy in beating people is far worse than even pulling teeth. At that moment, pain and fear overwhelmed Maz. Kusanagi raised his fist for another blow and told the boy not to dare die. Masa closed his eyes, hoping to hide from the pain and fear in his memories. He remembered his sister, who said that she didn't need gifts, because the most important thing for her was that her brother was there. However, another blow from Kusanagi knocked him out of his memories. Akechi adjusted his glasses and said that all this would end if Masa told them where he hid the money. The boy remained silent, receiving blows from Kusanagi one after another. His whole life seemed to flash before his eyes, and the brightest and kindest thing in it was his sister. The boy stopped reacting to what Kusanagi was doing to him. With each blow, Akechi became increasingly angry and demanded information. It was as if Masa had found his last strength, and he was able to stay on his feet despite the unbearable pain. The guy looked angrily at the director and said that there was no money. At this point, Akechi's patience finally ran out and he said to stop all this. The man gave Kusanagi the order to kill Masa. Meanwhile, George was rushing to the boy's house as fast as he could to help him. The boy was very worried about what the deputy director told him. George flew into Masa's house and froze in place. The guy realized that he had arrived too late. Masa lay on the ground, beaten beyond recognition and groaning in pain. George did not dare to come closer and remained near the entrance. Masa was on edge, but he immediately understood who had come, but he could no longer pronounce the name. George froze in horror and the realization that he was too late. After a few moments, the guy finally came over and lifted Maz's body. George felt the boy and realized that his 6th through 10th ribs were broken. Maz's breathing was rapid, indicating that the broken ribs had damaged his lungs. The boy had multiple head injuries and lacerations and cuts in his mouth. The pulse was weak, indicating that multiple injuries had led to a rupture of the aorta. Until now, the boy remained conscious only due to a state of traumatic shock. The injuries indicated that the boy had been tortured, not simply beaten. Confirming George's suspicions, Masa said that Akechi was after his money. The guy was glad that he was able to protect what he had accumulated until the very end. George told Masa to save his strength, but he knew he wouldn't be able to use the money anymore, so he gave it to his friend. George refused the money and said that the boy would spend it himself when he got better. Masa grabbed the guy by the hand and asked him to take the money. George looked angrily at his friend, who was wasting his last strength on arguing. Masa understood that he would soon die, and he did not want all his efforts to go to waste. The boy asked George to listen to him carefully. Masa said that the guy would need to go straight from this house to the coast, where he would see a large tree with a deep cut. At the roots of this tree, the ground will be dug up, and that is where the guy hid his treasure. Masa asked to take this money, but only on one condition. The boy asked George to get off the island and find his sister. George didn't know that Maz had a sister, so he decided to ask him again. Memories of his sister giving him a gift flashed before Maz's eyes. It was a scarf she made by cutting up her favorite skirt. The girl then said that she wanted to give her brother something to keep him warm. That day was one of the happiest for Maz. The boy smiled and said that his sister was a good, kind girl, so George should definitely find her. However, George said that he could not make such a promise to him. Masa became agitated and grabbed his friend tighter. Tears began to flow from the boy's eyes again, and he began to beg George, saying that his sister's name was Honjo Yui. Masa asked me to tell her not to cry. The guy asked to tell the girl that he apologizes for not returning to her. Masa said that she had always been the light of his life, and he would be very grateful if George would fulfill his request. After this, the guy's hand dropped and he became quiet. George looked at his dead friend for a while longer. Coming out of his stupor, the guy closed Masa's eyes. The tears in his eyes had not yet dried and were streaming down his face. George closed his eyes and froze, trying to come to terms with what was happening. Tears continued to flow from the deceased's face and drip onto the ground. They kept within themselves those warm memories of what seemed like a past life. That life where he and his sister, although not rich, were happy together. George couldn't leave his friend's body, so he decided to bury him. As he walked towards the forest, The boy didn't notice that the house was being watched. Soon, George was able to find the very tree that Masa had told him about. It felt like they were alone in the forest, but that was not the case. George dug around the tree roots to find money. Soon, the small shovel hit something wooden. The boy pulled a small wooden box out of a shallow hole. When George opened the lid, he found all of Masa's accumulated money. The guy looked at his deceased friend and said that he had found his treasure. George understood that Masa would not answer him anymore, but this seemed to make him feel better. The guy saw a scarf tied on his friend's shoulder and reached out to him. It turned out to be the same handkerchief from Maz's memories, but George did not understand its true meaning. George tied a handkerchief over his face, covering his mouth and nose, and said he would take it for safekeeping. At that moment, Akechi's voice came from behind, thanking the guy for showing them the way. George didn't seem surprised by the guest's appearance. Akechi, accompanied by his men, came closer and asked if Masa had died after all. The director said the boy was too stupid to agree to his terms and ended up losing his teeth, money, and ultimately his life. Akechi chuckled and said that it was a fitting end for the biotrash from the rotten island. George did not react to his taunts and only watched the actions of his opponent. The director extended his hand forward and demanded that the boy immediately give him Masa's money. George rose calmly from his seat. Having looked at the director half-turned, the guy said that he was not going to give anything back. Akechi said that there really were very stupid people working in the mines, although at first the guy seemed different to him. The director pointed at George and ordered his security to kill him. His men immediately rushed into battle, intending to tear the second guy to pieces as well. They were thirsty for more blood, but they still didn't understand who they were facing. George remained calm and prepared to respond to the blows. The guy's eyes seemed to be burning with a turquoise flame. George hit the first guard who approached him in the face, ducking from his blow. One by one, he eliminated Akechi's subordinates. The guy was getting closer and closer to his friend's main offenders. The opponent couldn't keep up with the guy's movements at all, and his blows were fast and powerful. The director's subordinates were unable to cope with their tasks. Several people rallied together, and while George was attacking one of them, he decided to come from the side. However, his boyfriend managed to eliminate him with one punch to the jaw. The closer George got to them, the more worried Akechi became. Soon, only 3 people remained on their feet: Akechi, Kusanagi, and George. The guy said that it was the most valuable thing for Maz, so he should take revenge for trying to take it. Seeing his guards wiping away the blood and unable to stand up, the director called them useless nobodies and reached into his inside coat pocket. Akechi pulled out a gun and pointed it at George, complaining that he always had to do everything himself. The guy was ready, because it would be very difficult to avoid being hit by a bullet in an open area. However, Kusanagi did not allow the director to shoot, saying that it was a shame to waste bullets on this. The blonde stepped forward and flexed his fists, saying that now they could continue what they had left off in the mine. George didn't respond to this and watched his opponent's every move. Akechi put the gun away and told the boy that there was no way to give up now. Kusanagi was determined, because George had already attracted his attention for a long time. The boys were prepared to fight to the death if necessary. George was determined to avenge Maz's unjust death. The first to rush into battle was Kusanagi, whose smile never left his face. The blonde struck one blow after another, but George easily dodged them. Kusanagi pressed with terrible force, forcing the guy to retreat back. George watched the guy's movements and technique carefully. The boy soon realized that Kusanagi had once been involved in boxing and had achieved some success. The blonde man praised George for his good footwork. Kusanagi said that simply dodging wasn't enough to win, but that was when he got distracted. George took advantage of the fact that the blonde usually delivered straight punches and ducked under his arm. The guy hit Kusanagi in the chest with all his might and even made him wince in pain. However, all this was useless, because the blonde did not move from his place. Akechi smiled, knowing that no matter how fast George was, he wouldn't be able to withstand Kusanagi's power. The blonde looked at his opponent and said that it was a good blow. Kusanagi smiled and said that the guy just didn't have enough strength to defeat him. This is precisely what has been the stumbling block since George was reborn. When Kusanagi swung again, his true strength became clear. At that moment, George felt like he was fighting a giant he couldn't defeat. The guy understood that he wouldn't have time to dodge the blow, so he crossed his arms in front of himself to take less damage. Kusanagi delivered one precise blow. George was thrown aside, but he still held his position. For the first time, the boy felt helpless in the face of enormous power. George felt pain in his arms and hoped that the bones were not damaged. Akechi watched the fight with pleasure and believed that no slave could defeat Kusanagi. George needed to quickly change tactics and take the enemy not with strong attacks, but with many weaker and more accurate ones. The guy quickly approached Kusanagi and began to deliver numerous blows to his head. Akechi watched the change in tactics carefully and thought that the blonde couldn't be stopped with such light blows. This was true, because soon Kusanagi pushed George aside and with a wide grin on his face began to attack again. George put his hands in front of him again to cover his face and stomach. Kusanagi delivered another powerful blow, causing the boy to wince in pain. The blow landed on George's crossed arms. The guy was pushed back a few meters again. When George managed to catch his balance and stand firmly on his feet again, he felt something strange. The guy felt as if the ground was starting to slip out from under his feet and turned around. George saw that he was on the very edge of the cliff. Several small stones fell off the cliff and into the water, and the guy immediately turned back to his opponent. Kusanagi was already running towards him and asked if the guy really thought it was possible to win if he defended himself all the time. The blonde was about to hit George again, but this time he didn't cover himself with his hands. The guy waited for the right moment and stepped aside a little so that Kusanagi's fist passed him. After this, George crouched down a little and ducked under his opponent's arm. With a blow from behind his opponent's hand, the guy hit Kusanagi in the face with such force that the blonde man started bleeding. This blow was much stronger than any that George had dealt before. The guy was confident that this time he had managed to inflict good damage on Kusanagi. The blonde even took a couple of steps back and staggered as if he was about to fall. George was already confident of his victory, but Kusanagi's subsequent reaction showed otherwise. The blonde man, with a crazy smile on his face, wiped the blood from his face and said that the guy had entertained him well. Kusanagi said he didn't expect anything worthwhile, but George really surprised him. George again prepared for attack and took up a defensive position. Kusanagi realized that the guy was going to counterattack again, which was a very good position for him. However, this time the blonde won't fall for it. George was about to dodge Kusanagi's fist, but it suddenly froze in front of his face. While the guy was trying to figure out what his opponent was planning, the blonde swung his leg. Akechi realized that Kusanagi had decided that the slave standing in front of him was also a boxer in the past. The director also believed that George was a former boxer, so the kick should have knocked the guy off balance. However, George was proficient in several martial arts, so he noticed the swing in time. The guy put his hands in front of his body and took the kick. Kusanagi realized that his plan had been discovered and tensed up. George took advantage of this pause and rushed at the blonde with his whole body, grabbing him. This helped the guy to knock Kusanagi to the ground and end up on top. Akechi was so shocked that he couldn't help but scream. George deftly pinned Kusanagi to the ground and twisted him into a headlock. The blonde started to panic and asked how the guy was able to count his movements. George raised his hand and said that a high center of gravity, stable foot position, and the use of kicks and punches are the hallmarks of martial arts. After this, the guy struck Kusanagi on the head with his elbow. The blonde's nose turned out to be broken, but after that he began to come to his senses. George was about to finish the guy off with another elbow to the face. However, before the blow, he noticed a mocking smile appear on Kusanagi's face. Before George could strike, the blonde grabbed him by the neck with his hand. Kusanagi's grip strength was so great that the boy immediately began to choke. The blonde looked at his opponent with a smile and said that he had tried hard and was close to winning. With one sharp movement, Kusanagi switched places with the guy and said that they were fighting here from the heart and not for honor. The blonde grabbed George by the neck with both hands and reminded him that they were fighting to the death, not participating in a tournament. Kusanagi looked at the guy predatorily and repeated that there were no rules now. George tried to free himself, but the strength was on the blonde's side. Akechi watched the fight with interest and noted that he hadn't seen Kusanagi fight at full strength in a long time. There have been several slave rebellions on the island, and there were even experienced fighters among them. However, none of them were able to defeat Kusanagi or even put up a good fight. The blonde was taken in by them because he was a beast without breaks, so even now he won't be able to lose to the skinny slave. Kusanagi continued to choke the guy and said that martial arts techniques could not defeat him. George knew he couldn't get out by force, so he urgently needed to come up with something else. The guy decided to target pain points, which would help him save energy. George slammed his right hand into Kusanagi's neck, pushing him away from himself as far as possible. Because of this, the blonde loosened his grip and removed one hand from his neck. After this, George grabbed Kusanagi's torso with his legs and, pulling his arm, began to push him to the side. The blonde felt the guy trying to push his legs closer to his head. In an instant, George grabbed Kusanagi's right arm with his legs and threw them around his opponent's neck. With more force, the boy slammed Kusanagi's back into the ground, twisting his arm. Akechi was already confident of the blonde's victory, but in an instant, everything changed. The guy grabbed his opponent's right hand tightly. George pressed his feet into Kusanagi's left arm, completely immobilizing his opponent's arms. The guy reminded the blonde that they had simply gotten into a fight. Kusanagi didn't understand why the guy was saying this now. George grabbed his opponent's arm with both hands and pinned it between his legs. Kusanagi felt pressure in his elbow joint and guessed what the guy was about to do. George began to press down on the arm with all his might, bending it into an unnatural position. Soon the elbow joint cracked and the blonde's arm was broken. Kusanagi couldn't help but cry out in pain. George dropped his opponent's hand and climbed on top of him again. The guy told Kusanagi not to be too delusional. George said it wasn't just a fight, and certainly not a duel of different styles. The guy looked at the enemy with burning eyes and said that only one would remain alive. At some point, Kusanagi felt as if he saw a completely different person in front of him. The strongest fighter of the elite ghost squad, George Sai, despite his well-honed fighting skills, has never fought on the street. Even after being reborn, the boy was not going to give up his beliefs, so this fight was not something ordinary for him. Kusanagi said that it would be even better this way and was about to attack the guy sitting on him again. The blonde reached out his hand towards his opponent, again intending to grab him by the neck. However, George reacted quickly and leaned forward with his head, hitting his opponent's fingers with his head. This caused Kusanagi's fingers to twist at an unnatural angle, and he began to scream in pain. George swung at his opponent with all his might and thought that Mr. War had never fought before. This time, the boy accepted the challenge because he was going to kill Kusanagi. Seeing the swing, the blonde was distracted from the pain in his broken bones. Before the blow, he seemed to see a hammer coming down on his head instead of George's hand. At the last moment, Kusanagi was able to jerk to the side and dodge the elbow strike. The force of the impact caused a crack to form in the ground, and this greatly frightened the blonde. Kusanagi knew that an ordinary person, when faced with the prospect of murder, would inevitably begin to hesitate. However, he did not see a shadow of doubt in George's eyes. The guy hit coldly, efficiently, and mercilessly. Now Kusanagi realized that although he was physically stronger than George, he would not be able to achieve victory. The blonde realized that the guy was determined to kill him here and now. Seeing George swinging again, the blonde put his hands in front of him. However, no matter how hard Kusanagi tried, the guy still found weak spots and hit the target. George was able to easily get around the block and hit the blonde's neck with his knuckles. Kusanagi's breath caught in his throat and he could no longer think coherently. However, the blonde's thoughts were haunted by the fact that this was no ordinary person in front of him. Watching George fight, one can conclude that he was never a fighter. The guy grabbed Kusanagi by the neck so that he could no longer dodge. The blonde's eyes reflected the silhouette of George, who was about to strike again. Kusanagi was willing to bet everything he had that the guy was a professional killer. The blow landed right in the blonde's face. With one blow, George knocked out several of his opponent's teeth. The fighting technique that Mr. War used was Krav Maga. This equipment is used by special forces in different countries. Krav Maga is the most deadly close combat martial art in the world. George grabbed a large rock lying nearby, causing Kusanagi to flinch. The guy swung the stone, intending to finish off the blonde once and for all. Kusanagi was already on edge from the previous blows, and now he had no strength left to resist. George's gaze never wavered for a moment as he saw before his eyes the man who had brutally murdered his friend. With all his strength, the guy brought the stone down on his opponent's head. Before the stone touched Kusanagi's head, George's hand froze. He remembered how Kay had stopped him last time. The boy said that one shouldn't kill even such bad people because then George would become like them. At that moment, the guy didn't attach too much importance to Kay's words. After what happened to Masa, George was filled with rage. But it was now that Kay's words came back to him. The guy decided to listen to the boy's words and threw the stone aside without finishing what he started. The stone fell from the cliff and sank into the sea waters. George stood up from Kusanagi's body and made it clear that he had no intention of killing him. A hoarse laugh was heard from the blonde. Kusanagi rose from the ground and asked if George was really surrounded by spiritual electricity. The boy's body really did emit a soft blue glow, and the same one had recently emanated from Kusanagi himself, but it was yellow. The blonde began to glow brighter and shouted that this was exactly the kind of opponent he had been waiting for all this time. Kusanagi said that they would fight until one of them died. George prepared to continue the fight, but he heard the safety click behind him. The next moment, a bullet flew straight through Kusanagi's shoulder. George barely managed to jump to the side, so the bullet hit the person standing behind him. Akechi got tired of waiting for the outcome of this fight and decided to intervene, drawing his gun. George was trying to avoid the shot, so he completely forgot that he was on the edge of a cliff. Kusanagi stood there for a moment, not understanding what had just happened. He looked at his chest and saw a bullet wound with blood flowing from it. George, meanwhile, barely managed to grab the edge of the cliff to keep from falling down. For a while, Kusanagi and Akechi forgot about the guy, looking at each other. However, the director was not saddened by the fact that he missed and hit the blonde. Akechi said that it didn't matter, since he was going to get rid of Kusanagi anyway. The blonde was furious at his boss's words. The director smiled and said that he had no use for a dog that couldn't even defeat a slave, so he had to get rid of him. Kusanagi had served Akechi for many years and could not tolerate such treatment. The guy rushed at the director, intending to kill him for betrayal. Akechi didn't expect this, but he was quite calm since he had a gun in his hands. The director started shooting at Kusanagi and said that the shot dog should not move. However, no matter how many bullets hit the blonde's body, he continued to move towards the man. Akechi continued shooting, but it was no use. Kusanagi was rapidly approaching him. The closer the guy got, the more his self-confidence melted away. The director understood that if Kusanagi got to him, he would not live, so he tried with all his might to hit vital points. Kusanagi put all his remaining strength into one blow and aimed it at Akechi. The man understood that his end might soon come. At the very last moment, Akechi managed to hit Kusanagi in the head. The blonde's fist stopped a few centimeters from the director, and it was clear that he was very scared. The light in Kusanagi's eyes began to fade, but he was about to say something. However, he still didn't succeed, and his unconscious body began to collapse. Akechi couldn't move from fear and tried to come to his senses. Kusanagi's body fell at his feet and did not move again. There was silence for a few moments, interrupted by Akechi's noisy breathing. But after a couple of seconds, his lips stretched into a smile, and a quiet laugh could be heard. The man kicked Kusanagi's body and said that he was very glad that he was finally rid of the guy. The director continued to vent his anger by kicking the blonde's body. Akechi's attention was drawn to the rest of his subordinates, who still could not fully recover from George's blows. The man shouted at them, ordering them to get up. The director ordered that the blood union be told that a slave had stolen a weapon and shot Kusanagi. Akechi turned his gaze to George, who had finally managed to climb back up. The man pointed a gun at the boy and said that it was time to execute the criminal who killed Kusanagi. George seemed to not pay attention to the director and kept glancing back. Akechi praised the boy for his excellent fighting skills. The director said that no matter how strong George was, ordinary people were not soldiers for war, because in modern society everything was decided by a battle of wits. The guy raised his hands up as if admitting his defeat. George didn't say anything to the man's attack and simply stood there. For a few moments, Akechi was confused and slowed down. However, soon a malicious smile appeared on his face. Akechi and his men laughed at George's fear of facing the gun. The director asked if the boy really wanted to surrender, but he never received an answer. Akechi said he would kill him no matter what. The director came closer and said that the guy had wasted his time and bullets, and that was a grave sin. Akechi said that putting the guy at the edge of the cliff was a big mistake. George continued to stand there, as if he had turned into a statue. Behind him, the waves were crashing against the rocks, but another sound was mixed in with the noise of the waves. The sound grew louder, and George said that there was no mistake in this, because everything was going according to his plan. A few moments later, Akechi also heard the sound and became wary. The man raised his head and saw what was making the sound. A combat drone that guards the island was quickly approaching them. Akechi saw him for the first time, and now he began to panic and retreat back. George glanced carefully at the drone, trying to remain as still as possible. The drone emitted a loud signal, indicating that it had already acquired the target. One of Akechi's subordinates guessed that it was a small plane, but he couldn't make it out exactly. The man took a couple of steps forward to get a better look. At that very moment, the drone fired and hit him right in the head. Seeing what had happened, Akechi immediately guessed what they were up against. The director looked at his assistant in shock and could not believe what they were faced with. His subordinate died instantly and now lay on the ground. The other assistants were shocked by what they saw and started screaming. The drone detected the sound, but was in no hurry to attack, as it could not find the source of the sound. Akechi's subordinates became frightened and decided to flee, which turned out to be their main mistake. The drone instantly detected movement and locked onto the target. The hunter gave the signal that he was beginning to eliminate the target and flew after the fleeing men. George understood perfectly well how this device worked, as he had encountered it many times during his service. This crazy stalker interprets moving objects as prey. That's why he hunts those who move. The sensor accurately tracked the movements of its victims. A few moments later, the drone began the destruction and opened fire. Almost immediately, Akechi's subordinates were killed. There was silence for a while, interrupted only by the director's swearing. George realized that his plan had not gone quite according to plan. He saw Akechi in front of him, who clearly understood what had come from the sea. The man was shaking with tension, but hadn't moved at all since the drone appeared. This meant that the director knew from the very beginning that a drone was flying towards them. All that remained was to figure out how to proceed in this situation. Akechi wanted to shoot George, but now he didn't have that chance because of the drone that was watching them. Having finished eliminating the target, the drone rushed towards the motionless guys. The director's hand began to tremble, either from fear or from tension, when the drone flew close enough. The man understood that it was George who brought this drone, but he did not understand how the guy knew about it at all. The boy irritated Akechi more and more, so he really wanted to kill him. George took advantage of the fact that his face was hidden behind a scarf and said that the director should know about all the features of this drone. The guy reminded him that if Akechi pulled the trigger, the drone would kill him first. The man understood this perfectly well, so he flinched when the drone flew close enough to him. The drone seemed to detect this movement and flew very close to Akechi. The barrel turned towards the director but did not fire. The man thought that the drone should not react to the trigger being pulled. George said that Akechi could check it out if he thought his warning was nonsense, and he would be responsible for the consequences himself. The director realized that the guy knew this model of drone very well, but he couldn't understand how he knew about it. George said that in reality, Akechi is a coward who is not only afraid to move, but also can't even say a word. The director was beside himself with anger at the man who dared to insult him. The man convinced himself that the drone would not notice the movement of his finger by just a centimeter, but his hand continued to shake. Akechi was just thinking about firing when the drone started beeping. After looking at the drone, the man realized it was too much of a risk. Akechi had already seen what would happen to the person the drone targeted. George watched the director's torment and realized that his time would soon be over. The guy knew there was no evidence that the drone would respond to the finger movement. George looked at the drone again and realized that it would soon consider the mission complete and disappear. Once the drone takes them out of its sight, the guy will be able to attack Akechi. George understood that the man was not strong in close combat, so he could easily deal with him. The drone circled above the boys' heads, looking for its new victim. George was in a better position because his arms were simply raised, while Akechi had to stand with his arm outstretched. At this moment, the director was trying to figure out what to do next. His hand shook more and more, but he still couldn't bring himself to shoot. George watched the man closely, waiting for him to make a mistake. A strong wind arose, coming from the direction of the forest. A powerful stream of air rushed through the trees and headed towards the standing guys. The wind ruffled their hair, but they continued to stand motionless. At some point, Akechi noticed that the wind currents were turning and blowing the drone to the side. The man decided that this was his chance. Akechi opened fire, hoping the drone wouldn't detect him. George tried to remain still, so one of the bullets hit him in the left shoulder. The guy took one step back from the blow and immediately froze. At that moment, the drone came to balance and aimed its sights at the guy. George held his breath, wondering if the drone had spotted him or not. A few moments later, the drone reported that the target had been captured. As soon as the drone announced the start of the liquidation, George started to run. The guy hoped that he would be able to escape, just like last time. The drone rushed after George. Moments later, the drone opened fire. George decided it would be best to jump off the cliff to avoid the drone's reach and switch to Akechi. By some miracle, the guy managed to avoid being shot. However, the drone had no intention of stopping and continued to pursue its target. George's shoulder was in severe pain from the bullet Akechi had hit it with. Running to the edge of the cliff, the guy pushed off the ground with all his might. For some time, the drone fired at the place where the guy had been standing a second ago. Having lost sight of its target, the sight began to spin from side to side. Having spotted the guy flying off the cliff, the drone fired again and hit George in the back of the thigh. The boy screamed and looked back. Akechi was clearly pleased with this turn of events. Blood flowed in a strong stream from the wound in the leg. George inevitably flew off the cliff towards the sea. The waves crashed hard against the rocks below, creating additional danger for the boy. George realized that he would be entering the water head first, which could cause him to lose consciousness from the impact. The guy had to act quickly to save his life. George bent over to give his body the necessary amplitude and turn over. Now the guy was falling feet first. George knew that with such injuries it would be difficult to survive if he fell into the water, but he had no choice. A few moments later, the guy's body completely disappeared into the seawater. The drone noticed that George had sunk into the water. With one sharp movement, the drone turned toward the sea and flew down, continuing to fire. Bullets rained down on the spot where the boy had just landed. Flashes and splashes were visible on the surface of the water. The bullets only miraculously missed George, who was trying to recover from the impact with the water. Quite quickly, the guy regained control of his body and looked up. The drone finished firing, but continued to circle over the water, trying to find its target. George decided to lower it to a deeper depth so that the drone would not see his silhouette in the water. After a few moments, the drone began to emit a signal, scanning the area. Having no longer found its target, the drone took off into the sky, announcing that the target had been destroyed. Akechi still stood motionless and watched the drone closely. As soon as the drone was out of sight and all sounds died down, the director slowly lowered his pistol. The man walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down to make sure George was gone. After Akechi couldn't find the body anywhere, a smile appeared on his face. The man said that this is how those who went against his will should end up. A crazy laugh echoed through the forest. After this, Akechi no longer intended to stay in this place and left, taking the money. The waves continued to crash against the rocks, but George was still nowhere to be seen. Soon a human silhouette began to appear in the water. George carefully stuck his head out from under the water and looked around. The boy calmed down when he realized that the drone and Akechi were no longer nearby, but the pain in his leg made him close his eyes. George saw the water turning red due to profuse bleeding from the gunshot wounds. The boy took off the scarf from his face to use it as a bandage. George tied the scarf tightly around his hip to minimize blood loss. It was already much better, but the guy understood that the bullets were still in his body. George was thinking about how he needed to remove the bullets and treat the wounds as quickly as possible. The guy swam towards the rocks to climb up them. At some point, George was overcome by a strange premonition. The water behind him moved differently than usual, as if something had cut through the currents. George realized something was approaching him and turned around sharply. The guy didn't even think about what it might cost him to end up in the water with open wounds. A large shark was swimming rapidly towards him. George was scared and didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, the shark had already swam up to him and emerged from the water, getting ready to swallow the guy. George was covered by a large shadow from a sea monster that was many times larger than himself. For a few moments, the guy froze in shock. The shark had no intention of waiting and was already about to grab him. George jerked to the side with all his might, avoiding the collision. The guy found himself underwater and realized that the shark had sensed blood, which is why it had swum up. Now George faced a new problem, and this time it was much more dangerous. The boy came across the one at the top of the food chain in the sea. George was now being hunted by a great white shark. The shark's body is shaped like a torpedo. This monster moves through the water at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. The great white shark's jaw-clamping force is more than a ton, making it the ultimate predator in the sea. George was once again able to escape the jaws of the sea monster that was determined to eat him. The guy immediately forgot that he had been underwater for a long time and realized this when the air was already running out. George was about to surface, but a shark passed in front of him and the boy saw its tail. The predator hit the guy in the stomach with its tail, throwing him up. The blow made George exhale and the air finally ran out. The guy tried to stay conscious and climb up. The shark circled around him constantly, looking for the right moment to attack. Soon, the guy found himself on the surface and was able to take a long-awaited breath. George was in no hurry to relax and immediately looked at the water. Soon, a large shadow began to appear under his feet, indicating that the shark was surfacing after him. George took as much air as he could into his lungs and dived again. The guy tried not to dive too deep so that the shark could not suddenly pull him to the bottom. George saw the predator rapidly approaching him. The guy had time to prepare for a face-to-face encounter with the shark. George began to collect all the internal energy in his body. Within moments, his body began to glow with the power that was overwhelming him. George knew that sharks like to attack by surprise. However, they cannot stand it when their prey becomes aware of their presence, so he hoped that his actions would scare them away. The guy tried with all his inner strength to show the monster that he would be stronger. Sensing the energy emanating from George, the shark froze for a moment. However, blood continued to flow from the boy's wounds, coloring the water around him. Sharks could easily smell blood from many kilometers away, and when they were just a few meters away from their target, they became enraged. Having sensed George's blood, the shark decided to attack. The predator opened its mouth and quickly swam towards the guy. George quickly realized why his plan hadn't worked. No matter how hard he tried, it was impossible to stop the bleeding from gunshot wounds in the water. George began to think that sharks had another vulnerable spot. This time, the guy's target was the tip of the shark's nose. Many say that the tip of the nose is the most sensitive part of the predator, so a blow to it can disorient the shark. It is in this place that the shark's organ, the ampulla of Lorenzini, is located. The predator was rapidly approaching, and George was preparing to strike. After a few moments, the shark was close enough for the guy to strike. The guy was convinced that this method would work. However, the shark didn't seem to even notice the blow. She swam further and hit George in the chest with her nose. The force of the impact threw the boy's body several meters above the water. Following the guy, a shark jumped out of the water, getting ready to swallow him. George realized that his plan didn't work because the difference in their sizes was too big. After flying a couple of meters, the guy fell into the water again and for a couple of moments lost touch with reality. His body was in severe pain from the impact with the water, and it did not improve the gunshot wounds. George emerged from the water and began coughing. The guy quickly came to his senses and began looking around in search of the predator. George felt something large approaching him from behind. The guy reacted instantly and turned around. However, the shark was in its element, so it acted much faster and was already close. George tried to swim to the side, but the predator grabbed him by the shirt. The guy felt the shark begin to pull him under the water. George understood from the very beginning that man could do nothing against the master of the seas. All his attempts to escape were in vain, and his body sank into the sea abyss. The air in my lungs was rapidly running out, and my temples were starting to ache from the pressure. The capillaries in the guy's eyes burst from the strain and the salt water. George had no chance of escape. Gradually, the guy began to lose hope and thought that everything was fine with him, since he was not going to cling to life because it looked pathetic. George began to lose consciousness, and impenetrable darkness began to fill his mind. But at some point, the guy began to hear a familiar voice. George saw a silhouette from the past in front of him, asking him to return. The guy clearly saw Sophia in front of him, who demanded that he return to her alive. Suddenly, George's body was filled with strength and he opened his eyes. The boy grabbed the shark's skin with his hands to maintain a stable position. George seemed to have received a second wind, and thoughts of death receded into the background. The guy couldn't afford to break his promise again. George decided that breaking his promise would look really pathetic. Strength began to overflow the guy's body and he began to glow again. George moved away from the shark as far as his shirt would allow and swung. The guy tried to distract the shark from diving and hit it in the eye. However, there was no reaction, because the force of the impact underwater was much lower than on land. George did not give up and began to hit the same one over and over again. However, all his efforts were in vain, as the shark did not pay any attention to him. The predator was much larger than the boy, and the water slowed its attacks, depriving them of their strength. Even George's attempts to punch him in the eyes didn't help. The Lord of the Seas cannot be wounded in his own element. George grabbed his shirt and pulled it with all his might, and it finally tore. The shark continued to move forward, and the guy began to be thrown to the side. At the last moment, George managed to grab the predator's gills. The shark released the tissue from its teeth but continued to dive deeper. George realized that he still had one chance to harm the predator, so he gathered all his strength to strike. The guy was able to easily penetrate under the shark's gills and damage its internal, poorly protected respiratory organs. The predator immediately perked up and began to thrash from side to side, trying to throw George off. The guy continued to hold tightly to the gills with one hand, while tearing apart the shark's insides with the other. Soon blood began to flow from the predator's gills, mixing with salt water. The shark began to furiously spin circles underwater. However, she couldn't free herself from the guy's grip. George knew he couldn't let the shark throw him off because then it would turn against him. The guy had to do as much damage to the shark as possible so that it couldn't attack him back. Soon, George was able to locate one of the vital organs and tore it out of the predator's body. After this, the guy released the shark's gills and swam a little to the side. The predator seemed to lose consciousness and began to slowly sink to the bottom. George pushed off the shark's body and began to swim with all his might upward towards the surface. As soon as the adrenaline in his blood stopped working, the boy felt like he was about to suffocate. The shark no longer showed signs of life, and George stopped watching it. Soon, the guy was able to swim to the surface and finally take a long-awaited breath. George coughed up the water for a while, coming to his senses. However, a few moments later, a shark rose to the surface after him. The guy froze in place, not believing what was happening. George thought he had done enough damage to the shark to kill it. The guy turned around and realized that this time he definitely had no chance to escape. The shark opened its mouth and headed towards him, intending to strike him in the forehead. Georgie began to choke in terror, but he had nowhere to swim. The sharp teeth of the ruler of the seas were rapidly approaching him. However, at some point, the shark's movement slowed down and then stopped completely. George continued to stare at the predator, not understanding what was happening. Just as abruptly as it had emerged, the shark sank back into the water right in front of the guy. The guy saw how the water turned red and the predator's body sank to the bottom. George remained motionless, as if a cold terror had gripped his body. The predator only came to its senses for a few moments and swam after the guy, but the damage was too serious, so she died anyway. Gradually, George began to realize that it was all over. The guy began to breathe more confidently and relaxed. Looking up at the sky, George said that he was saved only thanks to Sophia. The boy looked towards the island and realized that he had been carried very far out to sea. George swam towards the shore to treat his wounds as quickly as possible. The guy started swimming the crawl, but after just a couple of strokes, his body refused to move. George lost consciousness for a few moments due to pain and blood loss. The guy quickly came to his senses and surfaced again, trying with all his might to stay afloat. He had no strength left to swim to the island. Because he had lost too much blood, his body began to cool down and he began to tremble. At that moment, the guy could only think about how he would get to the shore in such a state. Soon, George noticed how the sun's rays began to play on the surface of the water. The guy turned to the east and saw the rising sun. George stood still for a few moments, noting that it was very beautiful. The sun sank into the sea horizon, illuminating the sea and the sky. It took the guy a few moments to realize that it was already morning. Thanks to the reflections of the sun on the water, George was able to notice a log floating towards him. The guy thought that this was real luck. Gathering his last strength, George quickly swam to the life raft. Not without some effort, the guy was finally able to get out of the water. George lay down on a large log with his back and basked in the rays of the warm sun. The trembling still ran through the guy's entire body, but now he felt at least a little better. The boy became dehydrated from blood loss, and being in the salt water for a long time only made it worse. George watched the sun move across the sky for a long time. The guy felt like time was slipping through his fingers. The sun had already risen high above the horizon, and the cries of seagulls could be heard over the water. George couldn't believe that he had survived this time too. Thanks to the current, the log the boy was on was washed up on the island. Finally, George found himself on dry land, but his strength had completely left him and he couldn't even stand up. According to the guy's calculations, he was shot about 5 hours ago, which means he needs to hurry. However, as soon as George tried to get up, his body was struck by a cramp. The guy didn't even have enough strength to raise his head. George knew that being in the water for so long with a gunshot wound had given him a fever. A few moments later, the boy heard the sound of footsteps. George even began to feel as if the enemy was forcibly pressing him to the ground. The stranger gradually approached, but the guy could do nothing. George saw a female silhouette extending her hand to him and asking his name. However, the guy was no longer able to answer as he lost consciousness. George dreamed about his past life. The guy found himself in a military camp again. At that moment, he was practicing at the shooting range. Every shot he fired was right on target. George finished his workout and soon heard someone calling his name. A young man with blonde hair and blue eyes was running towards the guy across the shooting range. This guy's name was Rory, and he really wanted to meet the famous George. However, George had no intention of talking to the guy and simply walked past, saying that he didn't make small talk. It was noticeable how Rory became sadder before our eyes. The boy told the departing George that his parents had been killed by terrorists. The brunette stopped at these words but did not turn around. Rory shouted that the one who avenged his parents' death was Mr. War. The guy said that's why he wants to be as strong as George. Rory shouted that Mr. War was his true hero. These words made George feel strange. Before leaving, the brunette said that he was simply doing a task and nothing more. It seemed as if Rory was expecting to meet a completely different person. A few days later, the Ghost Squad entered a battle that was not going in their favor. They found themselves under enemy artillery fire, so they had many wounded. The detachment collected all the wounded and headed towards the camp with first aid tents. They needed urgent medical attention. Only experienced medics who were not afraid of the most serious injuries worked in the field hospital. They instantly determined the level of danger to life and acted in a coordinated and rapid manner. George was among those who brought the wounded to the field hospital. He stopped at the very entrance to the tent and watched as his colleagues were receiving assistance. One of the medics approached George and said that his shoulder was injured, but the boy refused help, saying that it was nothing. At that moment, the guy heard a familiar voice coming from the side of the beds. George saw Rory, who was covered in blood and bandages. The brunette stopped at the foot of the boy's bed and watched as the medics provided assistance to him. The blonde man kept calling George and asking if he was there. One of the female medics yelled at Rory to shut up and save his strength, and that girl turned out to be Sophia from George's memories. The girl said that Rory had broken his pelvic bones and fragments had entered his abdominal cavity, so he urgently needed to be taken to the operating room. Before the boy was taken away, he said with tears in his eyes that he probably wouldn't become like George. The brunette didn't say anything to him and simply looked at the guy's mutilated body. Rory started crying and said that he didn't want to die like that and that he was very scared. George only replied that they would all die sooner or later. The brunette said that they would all die sooner or later, so they had nothing to fear, because life itself meant nothing. Sophia ran up to George and handed him a bandage, telling him to stop philosophizing and help take Rory to the operating room. The brunette was confused, but the girl pressed him, saying that they didn't have enough people. Sophia put on gloves and said that she had to help all the victims. Soon, George was even forced to be present during the operation and pass the instruments. At some point, Rory's vital signs began to drop, but Sophia ordered the medics to stop panicking and act quickly. The girl began to resuscitate the boy and said that she would not let her patient die. George could only watch from the sidelines, but he was amazed by Sophia's desire to help everyone. At that moment, the guy couldn't take his eyes off her. As the sun began to set, all the wounded were given aid. George was finally released, but on the way to the main part of the field hospital, he heard how many medics admired Sophia's abilities. The guy found out that the girl had been working in hotspots since she was 17. George stopped at the entrance to the infirmary to catch his breath. However, even here, they did not give him any peace and lightly hit him on the hand with a bottle of beer. Sophia handed the guy one of the bottles in gratitude for his help and silence. The girl winked and said that she had asked a person without medical training to assist in the operation, so her superiors could fire her. Sophia thanked him again for his help and took a sip from her bottle. After this, a satisfied smile appeared on the girl's face, and she said that she now felt much better. George kept his eyes on the girl and asked if Rory would survive. For a moment, Sophia looked sad and replied that the chances were very slim. However, the girl said that in her experience, there were many cases where fighters dealt with even worse injuries. George said he considered the hopeless attempts to survive pointless. The guy said that no matter how much the girl treated them, they still got into trouble. That's why he doesn't see the point in trying so hard to save their lives. George asked the girl why she was doing all this. Sophia looked at the guy seriously and said that she was doing this because she wanted to save lives. After this, the girl took another sip from the bottle. At that moment, one of the medics ran out of the tent and called for Sophia. Having found the girl, the medic reported that Rory had come to his senses. Sophia immediately rejoiced and ran to the infirmary. George remained where he was and watched the girl run with joy to her patient. Sophia walked over to Rory's bed and asked how he was feeling. The guy smiled and said that he was in a lot of pain, but he wasn't going to die. George didn't understand such a sudden change in the guy. Before his eyes, he could still see Rory crying and afraid to die. George remembered Sophia's words about wanting to save lives. Now the guy saw a laughing girl who found her work to be truly enjoyable. It seemed that now George would never be able to tear his eyes away from Sophia. After some time, the wound on George's shoulder healed and he came for a checkup. Sophia removed the bandages and said that the swelling had gone down and there were no signs of infection. Therefore, everything was normal with the body. The girl smiled and said that she would agree to have a drink with him after work, since he insisted on it, to thank her for the treatment. George asked if this was his punishment, to which Sophia screamed indignantly. Everyone in the medical tent laughed and said that Sophia and George had been getting along well lately. Someone asked them if they had kissed yet, to which the girl ordered everyone to be quiet. One of the fighters said that he needed to get hurt more to get Sophia's attention. Another fighter said that he would take the girl to the bar himself since Mr. War refused. Sophia only listened to their comments with laughter, and George did not say a word. The guy was about to leave, but someone called out to him. George turned around to see Rory, who was still in the hospital bed in the infirmary. The blonde said that he had decided to leave the squad. George said it was a wise decision, because with that level of ability, Rory would eventually die. The blonde replied that it sounded cruel, but it was true. Rory said that Sophia pulled him back from the brink of death, and that is why he should live. George looked at the guy for a moment, and then turned his gaze to the opposite side of the tent, where Sophia was joking with the fighters. Despite the fact that there were many wounded in the infirmary, at the moment he was filled with laughter. Rory also looked at the cheerful fighters and said that he thought that the unit would be dull. George noted to himself that this was usually the case, but this was the first time they had experienced such an atmosphere. The guy was worried about only one question. Why had the atmosphere changed so much? George watched Sophia closely as tears of laughter began to flow. There was fighting going on, but people laughed, because even the military needs a break, at least during these short breaks. However, this was the last time George could relax, because a few days later, the number of wounded increased. Captain Back carried the wounded man into the infirmary and told the doctors that he was an urgent patient. The first man to catch sight of was Sophia, who asked what was going on. Beck pointed to the man strapped to the stretcher and said he was in cardiac arrest. The captain said that the girl must save him no matter the cost. Sophia said she understood everything, and after a quick examination of the victim, she ordered him to be taken immediately to the operating room. Near the exit from the infirmary, the girl passed George but was too busy, so she did not greet him. The guy looked at the gurney with the patient suspiciously. George saw burns on the man's head that were unusual for combat. The boy turned his gaze to Captain Beck, but did not say anything in the presence of the doctors. After some time, they went out into the street together, moving away from the infirmary. George had seen similar burns before, so what was happening worried him. These were equal circular burns located on the upper part of the body and had the same brightness. George understood that these were traces of high voltage passed through the body. The boy asked the captain if the patient was a spy, to which he received an affirmative answer. George said that Beck always knew how to determine the acceptable threshold during interrogation, so he would not bring the spy to cardiac arrest. The captain said it was all Ryan's fault, the food handler who messed everything up. George asked why they decided to revive the spy. Captain Back replied that he still wanted to extract information from him. George immediately realized that this was not without reason and asked who they were looking for. Beck was silent for a few moments, then announced that they were looking for a man who laundered money and supplied ammunition. They were looking for the real leader of the criminal underworld, Saeed Arash. This man was one of the leaders of Ignite. George's face immediately changed, because he would never be able to forget the name of this organization. The guy clenched his fist tightly and was filled with anger. George immediately remembered the events of 10 years ago. At that time, everyone called the guy not George, but Jojo. One day, a boy went to the market with his father and younger sister and asked to buy some fruit. The man was happy about this and did not refuse his son the purchase. George's father was a workaholic and traveled to the Republic of Aldemia for the first time with his children. The boy was very happy to spend time with his father and sister. They ate the fruits the man bought them with pleasure. They were together for only 5 days, but they became the happiest memory for Jojo. More precisely, they should have become the happiest memories. But everything turned out differently. On that day, a terrible terrorist attack of enormous proportions occurred. More than 2,000 people were injured in the terrorist attack, and George's family was no exception. The boy sat on the ground and stared at one point while the running people told him to run. However, Jojo didn't listen to them because in front of him was his father's body crushed by debris. The boy saw his younger sister's hand sticking out from under a pile of bodies nearby. Jojo immediately grabbed her and tried to pull his sister out. The boy tugged at his arm several times and after a few moments fell to the ground. At first, Jojo thought he had managed to pull his sister out, but when he looked at his hand, he froze in horror. The boy was still clutching his sister's hand, but it was torn from his body. Japanese news reported that 2 Japanese were killed and 1 was missing. However, the person in question could not have known this. That day, Jojo lost everything and walked through the ruined streets as if hypnotized. On the radio, the boy heard the commentary of the president of the Republic of Aldemia regarding the terrorist attack. The president said that today they must declare war. This made the guy think about the consequences of such news. Jojo stepped on a newspaper that was lying on the road and something about it caught his eye. The broadcaster reported that the terrorists behind this had taken too many lives. The newspaper contained information about the terrorist group Ignite. That day, Jojo's life fell apart, and he decided he would never forget that name. 10 years had passed, and George still remembered the people who did this to his family. Captain Beck said that for all these 10 years they had been unable to find the trail of Ignite. However, they will now be able to find their hideout if they extract information from the spy. George listened attentively to everything Buck told him. The man said that orders would come soon. However, Captain Beck wanted to tell George about this in advance. The man said that their next mission was an operation to destroy Ignite. George nodded his head slightly, showing his agreement. 10 years ago, the boy was too weak to take revenge on his enemies. However, now everything is different, and now he is ready to confront the enemy. Suddenly, the conversation between Beck and George was interrupted by a radio. One of Beck's team members asked for an urgent answer, as the matter was too serious. During the operation, Saeed came to and disappeared from the operating room. The fighter was even more worried by the fact that Sophia had disappeared along with him. Captain Beck grabbed the radio and began asking for details of the disappearance. Despite his desire to avenge the death of his family, George's first fear was for Sophia. Meanwhile, Saeed moved deeper into the forest, using the girl as cover. Sophia looked up at the treetops, through which the moonlight barely penetrated. Said followed the girl, threatening her with a knife. It was very dark in the forest, so Sophia didn't notice a tree root sticking out from under the ground and stumbled. The girl fell to the ground and screamed in pain. Said ordered the girl to never stop and to get up immediately. Sophia asked if she should try to fly since he wasn't even going to help her get up. At that very moment, Saeed brought the scalpel to the girl's face, causing her to fall silent. The man reminded her that they were already far from the camp. Said laughed and said that now he saw no need for a girl as a hostage. Sophia's eyes widened in fear. Despite his threats, Saeed did not kill the girl, and they moved on. The man continued to threaten Sophia with a scalpel, following her closely. The girl did not dare to speak again, fearing for her life. At some point, something clicked, and someone's voice asked the man where they should land. The man replied that there was enough space for them to land at coordinate SD-19. Sophia listened carefully and guessed that the radio microphone was built into Saeed's molar. The girl recalls checking the man's vital signs a few hours earlier. Sophia soon learned that quite a long time had passed since her cardiac arrest. She began to worry that resuscitation might not be able to bring him back to life. However, as soon as Saeed was connected to the devices, his pulse became noticeable. The girl jumped up to the devices and couldn't believe what she saw because they hadn't even started working yet. It soon dawned on Sophia that they were trapped. The girl turned to the nurse to warn her that it was not cardiac arrest. However, she didn't have time, because Saeed had already come to his senses and killed the nurse. Sophia wanted to say that the patient was still alive and pretending. But at that moment, Saeed himself cut the nurse's throat and did not take his eyes off Sophia. The girl saw her friend slowly dying from blood loss. Said's bloodthirsty gaze remained etched in her mind for a long time. For the first time, Sophia looked so scared and couldn't hold back her tears. Said threw the nurse's body aside and advised the girl not to scream. The man said that he had a device in his body that suppressed his heart rate so much that not all devices could detect it. Said that it was a very convenient thing, but it had one side effect. The man said that after using this device, he felt very nauseous. Sophia was shaking violently and was afraid to utter a word. Said ordered her to be quiet and began to slowly approach her. The man said that he always wants to kill the person who yells at him after waking up. Said that he wanted to use the girl as a hostage to get out of this base. The man promised that he would not force her if she did not want it, but the knife in his hands indicated that in that case she would die. Said that he could get out of here even if he didn't have insurance. Sophia was afraid to move and was trembling with fear. The girl couldn't hold back her tears. The further they went into the forest, the faster Sophia came to her senses. The girl understood that the Ignite terrorists had technical capabilities beyond all expectations. But that was not what scared her. For the sake of their goals, these people are ready to modify their bodies at an organic level. What was even more frightening was that taking the life of another person was a common thing for them. Sophia understood that if she didn't kill Saeed, he would soon kill her. The girl carefully reached for the inside pocket of her hospital gown. As someone who worked on the battlefield, she always carried some medications with her. Morphine is a drug that has a strong analgesic and sedative effect. Although it relieves pain and suffering, even a small overdose can cause coma. The morphine that Sophia had with her was in a high concentration. The lethal dose of this drug is 4 milliliters. Now the girl was trying to find the moment to carry out her plan. Sophia listened attentively to Saeed's conversation with his accomplice. Gradually, the approaching helicopter became audible. The birds began to behave restlessly due to the approaching noise. Said turned his full attention to his interlocutor, leaving Sophia unnoticed. The girl realized that this was the best moment. Sophia carefully pulled out the syringe with morphine. While Saeed looked away, the girl turned sharply and stuck the syringe into the man's neck. For a few moments, the girl froze, trying to figure out if her plan had worked. She injected the drug all the way, but her hands continued to shake. Said didn't have time to react and was now gradually losing consciousness, unable to do anything with the girl. The girl relaxed a little, realizing that her plan had worked. Said fell to the ground, foam coming out of his mouth. Sophia watched the man closely until the last breath escaped his lips. Said's body shook from the drug overdose. Sophia breathed a sigh of relief and wondered if injecting 10 milliliters of morphine had been too much. However, the girl relaxed too soon because the next moment Saeed came to his senses. The man grabbed Sophia by the neck and squeezed so hard that she couldn't breathe. Said's body was still shaking, but he was fully conscious. The man said it was a good idea, but he had long ago developed a resistance to such drugs. Said that this happened when a person experiences overdoses from childhood. The man said he hadn't experienced a morphine overdose in a long time, and it actually felt pretty good. Said raised the scalpel over Sophia and said that now it was time to take her apart piece by piece. The man apologized with a smile on his face for not being able to offer her pain relief. He said that Sophia was to blame for spending everything on him. The man pointed his finger at his chest and said that life is a duty. Sophia didn't understand what he was talking about. Said poked himself in the chest again and said that the soul is the guarantee. Touching his forehead with his hand, the man addressed God. Said asked God to accept Sophia as a sacrifice. His eyes spoke of the utmost degree of obsession. Having completed the peculiar ritual, the man cut the girl's clothes with a scalpel. Sophia closed her eyes, expecting to feel pain. However, after a few moments, she opened her eyes without feeling anything. Looking down, Sophia realized that the man had cut her clothes, exposing her breasts and stomach. This made the girl panic even more. The man let go of her face a little and brought the scalpel closer to it. Said asked why Sophia was so afraid since they were just meat. The man said that the meat becomes tough when cattle feel fear of slaughter, and it is all because of the stress hormone. Because of this, the color of the meat darkens, becomes dull, and loses flavor. Said it was terrible when you spend 2 or 3 years growing precious meat, only to have it turn into tasteless horror. The man stroked Sophia's face and said that this was the greatest loss. Soon the man calmed down and came to his senses. Wiping the tears from his face, he said that the girl should not be afraid. He promised that he would do everything quickly and carefully. There was a crazy smile on Saeed's face, and he didn't understand why Sophia wasn't smiling with him. The man raised the scalpel over the girl and ordered her to relax. His eyes glowed with obsession. Sophia couldn't move and could only look into the face of a real monster. The man began to lower the scalpel, intending to plunge it into the girl's neck. Sophia closed her eyes, awaiting her death. However, a moment later, a shot rang out and the scalpel flew off to the side. He hit the rock on the ground with a loud thud. Sophia opened her eyes when she felt blood on her face. Blood flowed from Saeed's shot-through palm as he looked closely at his wound. The man seemed to feel no pain due to an overdose of morphine. Said raised his hand to his face and looked through the hole in it. The man saw that the bullet had flown straight through and hit the rock ahead. After this, Saeed roared as loudly as his lungs allowed. Sophia looked at this in shock, hoping that her assumptions were correct. Behind Saeed, in the distance, George was hiding in the bushes. The guy was able to track down Sophia and Saeed, and at the last moment he was able to shoot the scalpel out of the spy's hands. George lay on the ground, aiming his sniper rifle. The glass of the sight reflected the moonlight, indicating his location. George took aim for a few moments, then pulled the trigger again. Once again, the sound of a gunshot cut through the forest, scaring away the animals in the area. The guy hoped that Saeed had not yet managed to figure out his location. However, this was not the case, because upon hearing the shot, the man immediately ducked, realizing that they were shooting from behind. The bullet still managed to hit him, damaging his ear. Said leaned down sharply, pinning Sophia to the ground with one sharp movement. The man calculated that the shooter was in the direction of 2 o'clock. Due to the difference in sound and impact, Saeed was able to calculate that the enemy was 1/2 kilometer to 1 kilometer away from them. A few moments later, as if to confirm his suspicions, a light flashed in the distant bushes. Said tried to determine the exact coordinates. He tried to tune the radio, but the walkie-talkie was too quiet. The man needed to know how many people surrounded him and what he should prepare for. However, The lack of radio contact could mean that the sniper was working alone. Sophia began to slowly come to her senses, as Saeed became distracted again and loosened his grip on her neck. The man didn't look at her, and the girl decided that this was her chance. Sophia abruptly pushed Saeed away and ran in the opposite direction from the shots. However, the man was much faster and was able to trip her. The girl found herself on the ground again, and Saeed asked her where she was going. The man grabbed her by the hair and said that her job was to be his shield. Said plunged a scalpel into Sophia's side and said that he would not accept refusals. Feeling a stabbing pain in her side, the girl screamed in pain. Something clicked in the man's head again, and he contacted his accomplices. Said gave the coordinates of the sniper who was hunting him. The man said that the sniper was sitting in the bushes alone and didn't even think to turn off his flashlight. Said told his accomplice to destroy him and everyone who came after him. A few moments later, the sound of helicopter blades was heard again. Said that snipers do not work alone, as they always have coordinators, supplies, and evacuation. Only with the help of all these people can the sniper survive the mission. Said that a sniper's miss instantly gives away his location, and in that case, he's a dead man. The helicopter appeared over their heads and began shelling the area where the sniper was located, based on the man's information. Said that since this sniper came alone for Sophia, he would become food for worms. The man said that the lone hunter becomes the hunted. However, Saeed was too distracted and did not notice the threat that had approached from behind. George rappelled down from the tree and found himself directly above the man. The guy said that he agreed with Saeed's words, which caused the man to turn around. However, he didn't have time to understand what happened when the world started spinning before his eyes. In an instant, the man's head flew off his shoulders, causing Sophia to scream. George came down to the ground and said that the shooting was just a maneuver so that he could approach unnoticed. Tears of joy streamed down Sophia's face, and she looked at the guy with a smile. George said that everything was going according to plan, and the lantern had been a great help. The guy said the dawn light played into their hands. For some time, Saeed's severed head continued to make sounds. George said it would be easier if he were good at long-range shooting. The guy looked at Sophia, who had her head down, and asked if everything was okay. However, as soon as the girl raised her head, it became clear that she could no longer hold back her tears. Sophia sat on the ground and could not calm down, crying so loudly that George was frightened. The guy came closer and told the girl that she should calm down because their enemies could still be nearby. However, Sophia did not calm down, but only rushed to hug George, saying that she was very scared. The guy was confused and blushed with embarrassment because the girl's top was cut off. George immediately remembered a recent conversation with Captain Back, who said that it is in a situation where a woman cries that a man can show his worth. The man then advised George to simply hug the woman back to calm her down. Beck said that this is when a girl can think about giving her body and soul to a man. That day, George called it the ravings of a drunk. Before leaving the tent, the guy said that Beck was messing around when he could be working on a strategy. Now George remembers this conversation and thinks about whether he should hug Sophia back. The guy stretched his arms forward to hug the girl, but something stopped him. George remembered the face Beck had made when he said that after this, the woman would want to give herself completely. The guy abruptly pulled his hands away without touching Sophia. It was clear from George's face that he was struggling with the choice. The guy thought that if he put his hand on Sophia's back now, it would look like he had ulterior motives. George looked at the girl, who still couldn't calm down, and it seemed as if she was starting to cry even harder. At that moment, the guy decided that it would be better not to touch Sophia again. George raised his head and looked at the sky, hoping that this would end soon. The problem was that the fighting genius, Mr. War, was absolutely hopeless at anything that didn't involve fighting. Sophia pressed herself tightly against him and buried her face in his shoulder, slightly muffling her sobs. George glanced at her from time to time, and with each passing minute he became more and more embarrassed. Soon the sounds of an approaching helicopter were heard in the distance. George immediately noticed this and realized that the enemy was returning again. When the helicopter opened fire, the guy rushed forward, covering Sophia with his body. The helicopter stopped over their heads and continued firing. George quickly picked up Sophia and hid behind a large tree. The guy started looking around to see if there were any more enemies nearby. George knew they had already missed their chance to escape unnoticed, so he picked the girl up in his arms. Sophia screamed in fear, but the guy didn't pay attention. The girl saw where they were heading and asked George to stop. However, the guy ignored this request and told Sophia to hold on tighter. George ran purposefully with the girl in his arms towards the cliff. Having reached the very edge, the guy jumped forward, pulling Sophia along with him. The girl saw the height from which they fell, which brought tears to her eyes. The boy and the girl were falling rapidly down, accompanied by Sophia's loud screams. Below, a river with a strong and fast current awaited them. Due to the stress she experienced, Sophia lost consciousness before they landed in the water. Some time passed, and the girl gradually began to come to her senses. Sophia opened her eyes and exhaled, feeling the heaviness in her lungs. The girl heard the sound of the waterfall and stood up to look around. She was next to a small river into which a small waterfall flowed. The girl didn't see anyone nearby, and this made her tense. Soon, George came out from the forest and asked her if she was okay. The guy was shirtless and carrying firewood in his hands, promising to make a fire so that Sophia could warm up. Seeing George's naked torso, the girl became embarrassed and could not say anything in response. The guy sat down next to Sophia and began to stack firewood, saying that he had walked here along the valley along the river, so they were able to break away from their pursuers. George said that they would leave as soon as they regained their strength, and the image of the guy carrying her on his back immediately popped into the girl's head. The guy smiled and said that it would take about half a day to get to the camp. A blush appeared on Sophia's cheeks, and she thanked George for saving her. Without turning to face the girl, the guy said that everything happened by itself. Sophia decided it would be wrong to sit still while George was making a fire. The girl jumped up from her seat, spreading her arms, and asked if she should go and look for food for them or find more firewood. However, Sophia completely forgot that her clothes had been cut by Saeed. It was at that moment that George turned in her direction and saw the girl's naked breast. The guy froze in place, instantly blushing. Sophia realized the situation she found herself in and quickly covered herself with her hands, screaming. The girl took a step to the side but tripped over the branches, losing her balance. Sophia fell forward by inertia, straight onto George. The girl hit herself, causing her to close her eyes for a few moments. However, she soon realized the situation they were in and opened her eyes. George was very red and was clenching his teeth too hard. Sophia didn't know what to do next, because the more she thought about it, the more these thoughts controlled her. The girl pinned George's hands to the ground, towering over him. At some point, it seemed to the guy that the girl began to weaken and fall on him. George tried to force himself to remain a soldier and keep his composure. The guy saw how Sophia reached her lips towards him, and after that, all his attention was concentrated on this. George knew there was nothing he could do about it. The guy closed his eyes as Sophia's lips were about to touch his. However, a strange rustling sound in the bushes not far from them caused them to become distracted. Sophia looked fearfully towards the forest, expecting that someone would attack them at any moment. George noticed this too and quickly pulled himself together. The guy switched places with Sophia, ending up on top of the girl. George pulled out his gun and took aim, while the girl hastily adjusted her clothes. For a few moments they froze, listening to the noise of the forest. The rustling gradually approached, and soon the unexpected guest was supposed to appear. Sophia froze, afraid to even move. A few moments later, a squirrel ran out of the bushes and sat down in the clearing. The rodent looked at the frightened guy and girl and gnawed on something. George lowered the gun and said that Sophia had nothing to worry about. However, there was no answer, which made the guy look at the girl. Sophia looked at him and didn't know what to say, so she remained silent. Under the intense gaze, the girl quickly came to her senses and continued to cover her exposed chest with the cut clothing, apologizing for what had happened. George got up from the ground and walked towards the firewood, saying that the girl had not yet fully come to her senses. The guy said it was called an acute combat stress reaction, because intense tension and fear on the battlefield cause emotional turmoil and irrational behavior. George glanced at Sophia and said that he would watch the fire and that she should lie down and get some more sleep. The girl looked at the guy for a few moments as if he had offended her. Unable to contain herself, Sophia called George a fool. The guy decided not to pay attention to this, but the girl did not calm down and reached out to him. Sophia grabbed George by the neck and turned him forcefully towards her. The girl asked what right he had to diagnose her. George was surprised and said that he had not diagnosed her, but was merely stating a fact. Sophia was indignant and said that her condition was not a reaction to stress during the fight. George didn't like the girl's behavior and he wanted to move away, but she didn't let him do it. For a few moments, Sophia turned away, trying to hide the blush on her cheeks. However, she still plucked up her courage and looked the guy in the eyes, saying that she was simply in love. After this, the girl closed her eyes and began to move closer to the guy's face again. George Sai was a brilliant soldier and a master of close combat. He is able to dodge any blow during hand-to-hand combat, even if he is fighting a boxing master. Having noticed the barrel of a gun, he can even dodge a bullet. Sophia's movements were much slower than anything the guy could handle. They were slower than any blow during hand-to-hand combat. Moreover, they were slower than a shot from a firearm. The girl approached his face very slowly, as if giving him the opportunity to dodge. However, George didn't even try to do anything about it. A few moments later, their lips touched. George closed his eyes and responded to the girl's kiss. The guy couldn't dodge this attack. The squirrel climbed a tree, found a nut on the ground, and watched what was happening. George not only couldn't dodge, he didn't even want to do it. It happened a month ago, but it felt like an eternity had passed. After returning to camp, George Sai set out on his final mission. No matter how much he promised Sophia to return, he was unable to fulfill his promise. George came to, finding himself back in his new body. The guy jumped up on the bed and realized that he was tied with belts that allowed him to move freely. Stretching forward a little further, George realized that the straps were preventing him from getting off the bed. The guy looked around the room he found himself in and realized that he was still on an abandoned island. Ahead, he saw a girl doing something on the table not far from the bed. The stranger stirred metal instruments in a pot of boiling water, then placed them on a tray. The girl turned towards the guy and asked how he was feeling, and George felt like they already knew each other. For a few moments, the guy froze, as it seemed to him that it was Sophia in front of him. However, soon the remnants of sleep receded, and he realized that in front of him was a completely different person. The girl with black hair and dark eyes said that it was too early for the guy to get out of bed because he had lost too much blood. George noticed a tray in the stranger's hands, on which lay various medical instruments. The girl picked up a scalpel and said that there was no point at all for the guy to stay awake. These words made George tense. The girl walked up to the table and pressed the red button located underneath it. At that very moment, the straps holding George began to tighten. The guy didn't have time to realize how the belts pulled him back, chaining him to the bed. The hands were pressed tightly to the bed, with no chance to move. The legs were in the same position, leaving no opportunity to defend oneself in any way. George realized that he was literally crucified on the bed, in front of a girl who had a medical scalpel in her hands. The stranger laughed at the guy's attempts to escape. The girl said that these belts are custom-made, so even a bear won't be able to escape. The stranger laughed at the fact that the guy now looked like a fish on a cutting board. The girl picked up the scalpel and said with a smile that the guy should behave like a fish. The stranger wanted George to shut up and not interfere with her while she was butchering him. The guy tried to pull the belts with all his might, but nothing worked. The girl, with a smile on her face, approached George, holding a tray with medical instruments in her hands. The guy began to think that this was not a simple coincidence, but someone's order. Suddenly, a thought popped into George's head about who could have done this. He saw Director Akechi's angry face in front of him again. The girl stopped nearby and took a scalpel from the tray. George asked if this was Akechi's order and what she was going to do with it. The girl repeated the director's name after the boy. George took this as confirmation of his suspicions. However, after that, the girl stopped smiling and asked what they were talking about. It seemed that only now did the stranger understand how it really looked from the outside. The girl put the tray aside and said that her name was Rina and she was a doctor. George stopped understanding what was going on in this place and waited for the girl to continue. Rina said she would explain the details of the operation, specifically that she was going to remove the bullets from the boy's body. The girl said that one bullet was stuck in the guy's right leg. Over time, lead dissolves, causing poisoning and damage to the nervous system. Rina said the bullet must be removed to avoid any unpleasant consequences. Now George understood what exactly the girl was going to do with him, but he still had questions. Rini said she had some bad news and one very good piece of news regarding the surgery. The girl said that it was impossible to obtain anesthesia on this island, so the operation would have to be performed without anesthesia. Rini said the belts were there to prevent the boy from twitching in pain, which could cause him harm. George looked at the girl doubtfully and asked what good news she was talking about. Rin explained that she is a doctor with Doctors Without Borders and has worked in war zones, so she is used to performing operations in such conditions. The girl smiled and said that the guy could trust her. George had heard of this organization before and knew that they were now an official humanitarian organization. Rina clapped her hands and said that this concluded the pre-operative briefing. The girl put on gloves and said that consent for treatment was needed, but verbal consent would be fine. However, George turned away from Rina and said he refused the operation. The girl froze for a few moments. Then Rina picked up the instruments again and said that now was not the time for jokes, as the boy had lost a lot of blood, so the operation should begin immediately. George turned his gaze to the girl and repeated once again that he refused the operation. The guy said that Reen was obliged to immediately remove the belts from him. The girl turned sharply to the boy and said that if the bullet was left in, lead poisoning would set in, which would lead to death from blood poisoning or sepsis. George closed his eyes and said that he understood this perfectly well, but he would not allow himself to be operated on. The guy ordered the girl to take off his belts, and then he could pull out the bullet himself since he had experience. Reen shouted that she was an experienced doctor and that the patient should not operate on himself. George said that he could not verify the veracity of her words because there was no evidence. The guy said that he couldn't take the girl's word for it because his life could depend on it. Reen began to understand George's feelings and could not think of any other way to persuade the boy. The guy looked at her and said that his life was on the line, so he couldn't trust just anyone. Reen flinched at these words as if she was offended. The girl was shaking from the realization that she could do nothing in this situation. Reen struggled to find the words to explain her urgency. The girl said that she, as a doctor, cannot simply leave the patient in this condition. George reminded Reen once again that medical ethics prohibits performing any procedures without the patient's consent. After this, the girl fell silent and looked down at the floor. George said that if the girl really was a doctor, then she should immediately remove the belts, following medical ethics. Tears began to well up in Reen's eyes. After a few moments, she finally reached for the belts without saying anything. In complete silence, the girl removed all the belts from the guy. After a while, she finished and moved a little to the side. George rubbed his numb wrists and asked Reen to lend him a scalpel. The girl didn't utter a word, reaching for the scalpel. She handed it to George carefully, but her hands were shaking violently. As soon as the guy took the scalpel, the girl grabbed his hand. Reen's eyes were filled with tears, but her gaze showed that she was determined. George was so weakened by the massive loss of blood that he didn't have time to react to her actions. Reen pulled the boy's hand and brought the scalpel to her neck. George tried not to twitch so as not to accidentally harm the girl. Reen said that since she could not obtain consent, she did not have the right to perform the operation. If she breaks this rule, she will cease to be a doctor. George still didn't understand what the girl was trying to achieve. His hand with the scalpel shook with tension next to the girl's neck. Reen said that she had a patient in front of her, and if she didn't get consent and simply backed down, she would also stop being a doctor. Hearing these words, George froze. The boy had heard similar words before from Sophia, who always strived to save people. George shuddered again at the resemblance between the girls. Shaking with fear, Reen said she would add one special condition to the agreement. The girl said that the guy should trust her with his life, and she in return would trust him with hers. George didn't understand why Reen was so stubborn and couldn't just let him go. The girl said that if she did anything suspicious, the guy could safely hit her. George didn't know what to say to such desperate conditions. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks, and she said that she was proceeding with the operation. George gritted his teeth in anger but did not answer her. For a while, the guy was simply silent, looking at the girl carefully. Then George smiled and began to laugh quietly. Reen looked at him blankly and asked what he saw as funny about the situation. George looked at her and said that there is one most terrible enemy on the battlefield. The guy said that there is nothing more terrible than a person who is ready to die. George noted that a person who is willing to sacrifice his life for a goal is incredibly strong. The guy said he gave up, which caused the girl to slowly calm down. George reached out his other hand to free himself from Reen's grip. The guy himself handed the scalpel to the girl and asked her not to let him down. George looked confidently at Reen and called her doctor. This made the girl shudder, but she was still glad that she had managed to persuade the guy. A slight smile appeared on Reen's face. Wiping tears from her face, the girl took the scalpel and asked him to rely on her. George started to lie back down on the bed, and Reen reminded him that there was no anesthesia on this island. The boy listened attentively to everything Reen told him. The girl warned that it would be very painful, after which she cut the bandages on the guy's leg. Reen said that she had removed George's restraints, but he was not to move under any circumstances. The bullet is lodged near a major artery, so it could cost the guy his life. George nodded to Reen and said he understood that. The girl looked at the guy doubtfully and thought that he simply did not realize how much pain he was about to experience. Reen put on clean gloves and said she was going to begin the operation. The girl picked up a scalpel and brought it to the bullet hole. Reen then began to carefully cut the wound to have more access to the bullet. The girl made a small incision and noted that George did not even flinch. Reen froze for a few moments, waiting for the boy's screams. Having heard nothing, the girl turned her head to look at George. The guy lay flat on his back and seemed to feel nothing at all. This made the girl say that she was very surprised. Seeing George's puzzled look, the girl said that she had removed bullets in conflict zones many times. However, even the strongest soldiers could not remain calm at this moment. The girl removed the bullets many times, but the patient's reaction remained the same. The soldiers could not bear this pain and screamed loudly. George said that pain can be suppressed with exercise. The guy said that if you can ignore the pain, you can endure almost any torture. Rena looked at the guy doubtfully and continued the operation. Having inserted the dilator, the girl thought about how much training it would take to not feel this pain. There was only one question running through Rena's head. She would like to know who George really is. Continuing to look for the bullet, the girl remembered the guy's words. George had a keen knowledge of what happened during combat, indicating that he had once been a military man. Rena said you can't judge by looks, but she thought the guy was from this island. The girl decided to ask if George had any combat experience. The guy asked if this information was really needed to carry out the operation. Rena winced and replied in the negative, apologizing. While the girl was again distracted by the search for the bullet, George looked at her. The guy found everything that was happening very strange. The longer he looked at Rena, the more she reminded him of Sophia. George looked away, thinking that he was just imagining it. The guy decided to change the subject and asked why the girl, being a doctor for a large organization, ended up in these slums. For a moment, Rin considered whether to answer such a personal question. She decided to answer briefly and said that she was hunting for one person here. George asked who they were talking about. For a few moments, Rina felt as if she could feel that hateful gaze on her again. The girl shuddered and broke out in a cold sweat. Rin still can't forget that fear. She remembered the face of the man who had once been her mentor. The man said that art always comes with sacrifices. The girl still couldn't forget what that man had done. Rina tried to compose herself and threw the scalpel onto the tray, attracting George's attention. The girl stopped for a few moments and took a deep breath, then exhaled, calming down. Rin smiled and said that she had found the bullet and would now begin removing it. George looked at her suspiciously, but replied that he was prepared for it. The girl took tweezers and used a retractor to open the wound to remove the bullet. Soon the operation was over, and the sun was already beginning to set in the sky. As soon as the operation was over, George went outside to make a crutch out of branches. The boy tied several sticks together and hit the ground with the crutch several times, testing its strength. After this, George tried to get to his feet, leaning on a crutch. After taking a few steps, the guy was convinced of the strength of the structure. Even though the boy didn't show any pain, the severe blood loss still affected him and his body was shaking. At that moment, George heard Rina call him. The girl walked out of her house and watched the boy try to walk. George stopped and looked at the girl. Rina said that the boy still shouldn't overexert himself. George thanked the girl and said that he would definitely repay her for this service. Rin smiled and said that the guy shouldn't worry about it. However, the girl then turned to George and said that since he insisted, he could repay her. The guy immediately tensed up, sensing a catch. The girl extended her hand and said that she needed to pay for the operation, hospitalization fees, and other related expenses. Rin said that George had to pay her 58,000 yen. The guy was shocked by these words. After some time, George went to a place on an abandoned island. Leaning on a crutch, the guy quickly approached the gate next to which stood a guard. George saw the cherry blossom petals falling and stopped. After looking around, the guy said that this was an amazing place. Cherry trees were in bloom above the gates leading into the small town, filling the air with a fresh scent. The small street was crowded with people, and the girls were dressed in traditional Japanese kimonos. However, judging by their appearance, one could say that the girls were here as entertainment for the men staying in the city. The girls approached the men and flirted with them, and they didn't mind. The town was relatively small, but it was clear that important people lived there. This place had all the amenities and even entertainment to keep the locals from getting bored. The town was surrounded by high walls, and the main entrance was guarded. George stood frozen in place, not getting too close to the guards for a while. The guy couldn't believe that such a place existed on an island of industrial waste. In Japanese history, such neighborhoods were called nureha, the paradise of lust. George froze and walked towards the gate. Seeing him, the guards asked him what he was doing there. However, George did not answer them, continuing to approach. The bald man smiled and asked if the boy realized where he was. When he got close enough, George stopped. The guards became wary when the guy grinned and started talking. George said that even though he was wounded, he was safe where he needed to be. We returned to the moment when Rini told the guy that her medical services were paid for. George sighed and said he had been wrong about her. The girl didn't understand what they were talking about and decided to ask the guy about it. George said that Reen worked for Doctors Without Borders, so he thought she lived to help people. The guy said that really, it all comes down to money. Rin got angry and asked what George even knew about her. The girl said that medical services require money because without it she would not be able to buy any instruments or consumables. George replied that there was nothing wrong with charging money for medical care. Rina calmed down a little and asked if the guy had money to pay her back. George wondered if he had the money to pay. He immediately remembered the dying Maz, who asked the boy to take the money he had earned with his own efforts. George frowned at the memory, especially knowing that he had lost Maz's money after all. The guy said he would gladly pay Rina, but he didn't have that amount on him. George looked straight at the girl and said that because of this he would not be able to pay. Such self-confidence in the guy's gaze made Rina indignant. The girl said that this was the first time she had seen someone say so openly that they could not pay. However, Rina soon came up with a way out of this situation. The girl said that since George couldn't pay with money, he had to pay with his body. The guy didn't like the look on Rina's face when she said that. Sometime later, the boy and girl came back into the house and began to emit loud sighs. George tried his best to please Rina. The girl periodically suggested to the guy how to do it better. Rina clearly enjoyed what he was doing. George sat on top of the girl and massaged her back. Rina was clearly relieved by the good massage. After a while, George said they should get back to their main topic of conversation and asked what the Nureka quarter was. The girl stood up and said that the guy was really good at massage. George and Rina sat down opposite each other and the girl began to tell him. Rina said that Nuraha Quarter is a walled city of lust, and she wants George to infiltrate it and gather information. The guy said it sounded like an infiltration mission and asked what the main goal of the investigation was. Rina said she heard that the man she was hunting was in this city. George asked what he was supposed to do with the man when he found him, and the girl said he was supposed to be killed. The guy didn't ask Rina about the reason and simply agreed. The girl got out of bed and said that George would help her a lot because women were not allowed into this city except for courtesans. Rina said the guy would be able to enter as a client without raising any suspicions. George looked at the girl and said that she had been trying to achieve this from the very beginning. The guy asked if the girl had deliberately inflated the price of her services so that he would definitely not have the money to pay. Rina froze in place. Realizing that she had been found out, the girl winked and said that she was counting on her debtor in any case. George realized that he was already trapped and that he would not be able to get out of it. We returned to the moment when the boy approached the main gate to the Nureha quarter. Upon learning that George had come to town as a client, the guards exchanged glances. However, afterward they laughed out loud at the guy's appearance. They asked how he could come to pick up a woman in such a dirty state. The guards headed towards George, and one of them said that the guy had definitely got the wrong address. However, the second guard said that there was no need to rush, because suddenly he really would turn out to be a client. The man approached George and mockingly asked him to show him his wallet. The guy didn't give in to their threats. He was told that every flower in this city is unique. They demanded that George post bail to pick at least one of these flowers. The men said that if the guy didn't have bail, they would call him a liar and beat him half to death. The guards were openly laughing at George and were already looking forward to the fun they were about to have. However, the guy was not going to back down because he had to repay Rina for her help. In response to their threats, George only sighed. The guy admitted that he really didn't have any money. After that, he looked at the guards with a firm gaze and said that he would pass anyway. These words instantly enraged the men. The guard asked if the guy had come just to watch. The second man also rudely said that this was not allowed. After this, the guards called the guy respectable and rushed at him with smiles on their faces. George did not respond to their threats. The guy stood still until the enemy got close enough. George dodged the men's blows with ease. The crutch fell to the ground as if the guy didn't need it. The guards hadn't yet had time to return their hands to their original position, so George grabbed them. The guy quickly turned over in the air before the men could even figure it out. George grabbed the arm of the guard standing to the right and dived behind him. The man immediately felt threatened. The guard turned around hastily and ordered George to stay put. However, the guy had already managed to jump on his back and grab him. George knew very well that the human cervical vertebrae are strong vertically, but fragile horizontally. The guy grabbed the guard's neck with one hand and pressed the other to his head on the opposite side. George needed to aim the blow from the side, at an angle of about 50 degrees. After that, all that was left to do was to put all your strength into the blow. Since the neck was extremely vulnerable in this position, the guy was able to easily break his neck. George has had to fight multiple opponents on his own more than once. The guy remembered very well the iron rule of combat when one fights against two. His first point was to immediately eliminate one of the two from the list of opponents. The guard fell to the ground dead, and the second one ran up to him and tried to shout to his brother. George said that no matter how hard the man screamed, his brother would no longer hear anything because he was dead. The second rule in a fight against two was to piss off the remaining opponent. His words really made the guard very angry. He turned to him, leaving his brother's body, and promised that he would kill George. The guy stood calmly and waited for the guard to attack him again. George compared it to a sack of meat rushing towards you, blinded by rage. The guy easily dodged the guard's blow, who began to act even more recklessly than before. George used his favorite move again and ducked under his opponent's arm. After this, the guy delivered one precise blow to the opponent's lower jaw. Several of the guard's teeth were knocked out and his eyes were rolled back in his head. The man leaned back and began to fall. George straightened up and watched the man fall, making sure he was finished. The unconscious body fell to the ground and did not move again. The next moment, a scream was heard behind George. The guy turned around and saw that the people in the neighborhood had seen their fight and were calling him a killer. The neighborhood immediately went into an uproar and they ordered George to be seized. Suddenly, through the noise, the guy heard the same guards demanding that he answer them. The entire fight had taken place entirely in his head, and the men were still questioning him. George remembered the condition Rina had set for him. The girl said that in the Nareka quarter, one should not make noise under any circumstances. Rina explained this by saying that in the Nureka quarter, they don't accept men who don't know how to play beautifully. The girl said that the doors of the flower garden open only to gentlemen who accept the rules. Now George was at a crossroads and could not go against Rin's words. The guy understood that if he used force, there would be a noise. The guards flexed their fists and asked why George remained silent. One of their men swung and was about to hit the guy. However, George had no intention of acting in the same way as he had been thinking about earlier. The guy looked sternly at the guard and ordered him to shut up. The man froze in place at such impudence. Then the guards felt a strange aura emanating from the guy. In front of them was definitely a guy who was half their size. However, the aura emanating from him made them feel as if a rock was bearing down on them. George did not interfere in the squabble and turned around. The guy said that he would come back later. Finally, George said that he was doing this because he was a gentleman. The guards stood frozen in their places, not understanding what had just happened. George started to walk back the way he came. The men watched him go with their eyes on his back and remained in complete silence. However, George was not going to back down from the task and approached the block from the side. As Rina had said, the quarter was surrounded on all sides by high walls. The only entrance to this city was the gate where the guards stood. George could easily climb over the walls, but to invade without knowing the internal structure is foolish. The guy heard someone approach him from behind and gasp. George turned around and saw Kay pulling a cart along the wall. The guy froze in place, as if hoping that he had not been noticed. However, Kay immediately recognized his missing friend and overturned the cart. George turned away from the boy and couldn't help but curse. Kay immediately rushed towards him. The boy couldn't believe that the guy was still alive. Kay took a running start and jumped at George with all his might. The boy wrapped his arms and legs around the guy, asking where he had disappeared to. Then Kay jumped around George and said that they even went out to look for him, but they didn't find anything. George ignored the boy's words and thought that he should come back here at night. But then he thought that there should be even more people in this place at night. Kay kept up with the guy and asked what he was doing there. George thought for a moment, and then told the boy that he had come there to buy a woman. These words made Kay scream in indignation. The boy instantly jumped a meter away from the guy. Kay was shocked by how Michio started acting. The boy asked what had come over the guy that he was now saying such things. Tears welled up in Kay's eyes, and he said that the boy had always been kind before. The boy recalled how Michio would ask him every day if he had eaten, and then treat him to food if he was hungry. Kay burst into tears and asked the guy to become his old self again. At that moment, George was thinking that there had to be a way around somewhere, so he had to go around the perimeter of the area first. Kay realized that the guy was ignoring him and started screaming even louder. George looked at the boy and said that he had made the image too perfect. The guy said that unfortunately he couldn't be that ideal Michio. George said that Kay had created an image of the ideal Michio for himself, and now he can't come to terms with reality. The boy gradually became quiet, as his heart was broken by the guy's harsh words. George said that he was currently thinking about the next step of the operation, so Kay should not interfere with him. The boy looked down and said that the guy was right, Before leaving, Kay said that he had completely forgotten that Michio was also a man. The boy said that all men sometimes cannot control such desires. Kay promised that if they met inside, he would pretend they didn't know each other. These words caused George to be instantly distracted from his thoughts. Kay slapped his palms across his face and said that it was time to stop all this. The boy picked up the cart and said it was time to go to work. George turned to Kay and asked what was in his cart. The boy froze for a few moments, not understanding why the guy needed this information. Then Kay finally said that the cart contained sheets, laundry supplies, and cleaning equipment. The boy proudly said that he was now courting the girls from the neighborhood. George immediately realized that the solution to his problem had been right around the corner all along. The guy leaned on his crutch and walked towards Kay. George said he could get into Nureka's quarter if he hid among the things in the cart. Kay didn't like this idea at all. George pulled the tarpaulin off the cart and said there was enough room inside to hide one person. Kay blocked the guy's path and told him he was crazy. George looked at the boy and asked why he was against it. Kay asked why he should help the guy buy women, since if they were caught trespassing, he would be in trouble too. George said he wasn't allowed through the main entrance without bail. Kay laughed at the guy and said that if he didn't even have money for bail, then he had no chance inside anyway. The boy relaxed, realizing that the guy didn't even have enough money to get into the block, and then George asked how much the deposit was worth. Kay said the bail could be around 500,000 yen. The boy grinned and said that he had never seen such a sum in his life. At that moment, George realized how to use Kay for his own purposes. The guy said he had an idea and reminded the boy that they still had Masa's money. Kay immediately became serious and asked if this was the same Masa they were talking about. George reminded that the guy was dead. The guy said that Masa left him all his savings so that he could find his sister. These words made Kay break out in a cold sweat. The boy asked if George really planned to use Masa's inheritance as collateral to buy a woman. The guy smiled and said that he had no other choice. George said he would have to use Masa's money. The guy turned around and said that he wouldn't be able to meet Masa's sister anyway, so there was no point in saving the money. George said that it would be better to spend the money usefully. Kay watched the guy leave and couldn't believe what he heard. The boy clenched his teeth in anger. Kay couldn't stand the guy's behavior any longer and rushed after him. The boy grabbed George and told him to stop this immediately. Kay, with tears in his eyes, said that Masa's inheritance could not be spent like that. The boy said that under no circumstances should this line be crossed. For a few moments, they were both silent. George said he completely agreed with Kay's words. The guy decided to take advantage of the fact that the boy still believed in goodness, even though he grew up in a similar place. George promised not to touch Masa's money if Kay helped him get into the neighborhood. After a few seconds, the boy let go of the guy. Kay clenched his teeth and began to shake. George watched the boy carefully to gauge his reaction. After a couple of moments, Kay raised his head, and the guy saw a smile on his face. The boy threw the tarpaulin off the cart and said that George had come up with a very good plan so they could relax. George breathed a sigh of relief and mentally apologized to Kay for dragging him into this. A light wind ruffled the crowns of the blossoming cherry trees, scattering their petals across the street. George walked slowly towards the cart where Kay was standing. The guy thought that the paradise of lust, blooming among the slums, kept many secrets within itself. It is precisely because of this strangeness that he may be hiding a way to escape from the island. After some time, the loaded cart pulled up to the main entrance to the block. You could see how nervous Kay was and how hard it was for him to drag that cart behind him. Ahead of the boy, guards were waiting and looked him over carefully. Kay hoped that he and Michio wouldn't get caught. George quietly told the boy not to be nervous and to behave as usual. Kay said the guy could rely on him, but it was clear how worried he was. The guards behaved calmly until the boy began to speak. Kay greeted the men loudly, stuttering heavily. At that moment, George realized that his plan wasn't so perfect after all. The guard looked at the boy suspiciously, recognizing him as the porter servant. Kay, without stopping, tried to rush into the block, saying that he was in a hurry. However, the guard sensed something was wrong and blocked his path. Kay began to worry even more, causing him to doubt himself even more. The guard said that it would be up to them to decide whether to let him through or not. Kay started saying that he comes here all the time, so they should have remembered his face by now. The guards decided to check the boy's cargo. Kay blocked their way and said that they had never checked his cart before. The man grabbed the boy by the collar with one hand and lifted him to the level of his face. The guard said that Kay was too nervous and therefore might be hiding something. The man pushed the boy aside and walked over to the cart. The guard began to remove the tarpaulin from the cart. George realized that he would soon be discovered, and then Kay would be in trouble too. The guy was only thinking about why he decided that the boy would cope with their plan. Kay was very nervous and made a mistake. Because of his behavior, the security guard's attention was focused on the cart. That's where George was, hoping he wouldn't be found. The man pulled the tarpaulin off the cart and looked it over. A surprised expression appeared on his face. Despite Kay's nervousness, the cart actually did contain cleaning supplies. The man started moving things from one corner to another, and Kay ran up to him, demanding that he take his hands off him. The guard took the paperclip and asked the boy why he needed all these things. Kay said that these were his work tools, and in his position he does whatever he is told, including minor repairs and taking care of the girls. The man continued to examine the tools that were in the cart. George had planned everything in advance, anticipating that their plan might not go as planned. With the help of all these tools, the guy prepared a secret hideout for himself in advance. George was hiding at the very bottom of the cart, under all the things. Half an hour ago, when the guy started to remake the cart, Kay, as its owner, initially protested violently. George said that this cart was about to fall apart, so he just wanted to fix it for free. The guy asked if Kay was okay with improvements, and he agreed. The security guard finished his inspection without finding anything suspicious and reported this to his brother. The men stood next to the gate again, leaving the cart alone. The guard stepped aside slightly and allowed Kay to enter. The boy quickly threw a tarpaulin over the cart and headed inside. George's plan worked after all, allowing him to get inside. Kay stopped on one of the quiet streets, after which George got out of the cart. The boy said the guards were wary of the way Kay was behaving, and this remark angered the boy. George smiled and thanked him for helping him in. These words made Kay blush with embarrassment for the praise. The boy started jumping around the guy and saying that he hadn't done anything special. However, Kay quickly came to his senses and said that it was time for him to work. Before leaving, the boy glanced at the guy and reminded him that Maz's inheritance must not be touched. George nodded his head and promised to keep it safe. The boy asked what the name of the courtesan that Kay served was, and the boy replied that her name was Issei. The boy winked at George and said that the guy was not destined to even talk to her. Kay said that his mistress was one of the 4 supreme ones. The boy reminded that the guy had no money, so he had nothing to do here. George ignored his words and thought that now all he had to do was find the man Rina wanted to kill. The guy recalled his conversation with the girl before he went on a mission. Rina said that the man's name was Kenzaki. George realized that he had too little data at the moment. The guy headed towards the busy street, realizing that there was nothing he could do about it and that he would have to cope on his own. On the street, many men walked accompanied by courtesans who flirted with them in every possible way. Former military man George Tsai always had one habit. Whenever he found himself in a new city, he would carefully walk around it. The most important thing was to feel the city, understand it, and explore it. After some time, George noticed that the buildings were erected according to a certain pattern, and each longhouse had 5 identical rooms. At the entrance to each room, as if inviting, sits a woman. Some rooms were closed, indicating that they were currently receiving clients. George noticed that there were many closed rooms. The guy thought that these people were too spoiled, since they didn't know their limits even during the day. George came across 2 open rooms. In the left room sat a girl with dark hair pulled back into a high ponytail. In the room on the right sat a curvy girl with her hair braided. George was thinking about which girl he should approach. After a few moments, he decided to approach the girl sitting in the left room. This girl seemed more attractive to him, and he decided to approach her. The guy thought she looked friendly. George approached the girl and said that he would like to know something. However, the courtesan's gaze immediately changed, and she looked the guy over appraisingly. George felt as if he was the one being chosen now. The girl quickly glanced at the guy with an appraising glance. After that, a smile appeared on her face. The girl bowed slightly and said that they were not accepting new clients. George didn't understand what they were talking about, but as soon as he tried to question the girl, someone called him. A short old woman appeared in front of him and said that they don't serve newbies. The woman said that pushy men were not welcome here, after which she slammed the door of the room. George repeated the word, which was new to him, without understanding its meaning. When the guy approached the girl in the room on the right, he was again called a newbie and refused service. No matter how many times George tried to talk to girls, they all answered the same way. Some girls timidly refused, while others did not hide their hostility. Every door closed in front of him before he could say anything. George couldn't even find out from them why they called him that. It was starting to irritate him, but he couldn't do anything about it. Suddenly, the guy's attention was drawn to a woman's scream. George knew he should have ignored it, but for some reason he couldn't. The guy moved towards the crowd of people who were watching what was happening. George heard the girl screaming and asking for help. The man grabbed the pink-haired girl and threatened everyone who tried to approach them with a knife. The neighborhood's internal security tried to calm the man, reminding him that violence is prohibited in this city. However, the attacker was not himself and continued to threaten everyone with a knife. The man said that he had invested too much money in this courtesan. The attacker was furious that he had given away all his money, but the girl never responded to him. The guards shouted that it was not so easy to become a regular customer. The man shouted that it was impossible to become a client in this city, since they only rob other people. The attacker shouted that the entire area was one big cesspool. George stood to the side, trying not to attract undue attention to himself. The attacker said that he could not stand it any longer and would soon fall into the category of slave miners. These words began to shed light little by little on the system of this island. George suggested that those people who owed money to the district were sent to the mines. The attacker held a knife to the courtesan's face and offered to let her die together. The guards didn't know what to do in this situation and didn't dare come closer. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard saying that the sluts from the dirty quarter could not be left unanswered. The stranger was not afraid to come closer and ordered everyone to move aside. The guard stepped aside to let Mrs. Issei pass. Hearing the name, George immediately remembered that this was the woman Kay served. The attacker began to threaten the woman, saying that if she came closer, he would kill the courtesan. However, Issei completely ignored his words and approached with a slow, calm step. The man fell silent when the woman stopped directly in front of him. A few moments later, Issei slapped the man with all her might. The woman said he was such a loser that he couldn't even become a regular customer. Issei said that he had no right to wave a knife here and arrange a joint suicide. The woman said that this hadn't happened in the flower quarter for a long time. Issei took out a handkerchief and began to wipe the hand with which she had hit the man. She said that someone who scares but is not ready to kill has no right to desecrate their pride. Issei told the man to act like a loser since he was one. The woman ordered the attacker to silently leave the city and not return. Issei turned to the security guard and ordered him to take the man out of the area. However, the guards were in no hurry to carry out the order since the attacker had a knife. When Issei heard this, she looked indignantly at the men who were afraid to approach the attacker. Meanwhile, the man began to recover from the slap. His manhood was violated, so he was filled with anger. The man pushed the pink-haired courtesan aside and ran at Issei with a knife. The woman heard the man scream and turned around, but did not have time to react. At this point, George decided to intervene and rushed forward. The guy threw down his crutch and began to make his way through the crowd, pushing everyone in his path. In an instant, he rushed forward, finding himself next to Issei. The attacker had already raised his hand to strike and was about to stab the woman with a knife. George came closer and grabbed Issei by the dress. The guy tugged the fabric back, helping the woman avoid the blow. Issei didn't have time to understand what had happened. She saw George hold her from falling with one hand and use the other to fend off the man's attack. The guy grabbed the attacker's arm and twisted it around. The man screamed in pain and couldn't even defend himself. George easily knocked the attacker over and pinned him face down on the ground. Issei was able to straighten up and find her footing again, looking at the guy in surprise. The guards didn't even have time to react to the attack before it was all over. George showed the guards a knife and suggested that they must have handcuffs to restrain the man. After some time, the disarmed troublemaker was shackled and taken away. The pink-haired courtesan approached Lady Issa and bowed low, apologizing for what had happened. The woman put her hand on the girl's shoulder and said that this place was full of people who thought they were invulnerable. Issei said that she simply couldn't stand being made a laughingstock of, but next time, the girl should be more careful. The courtesan smiled and thanked her mistress for her help. When the girl left, Issei turned and addressed George. The woman thanked him for saving her and asked if the guy practiced martial arts. George confirmed this, and Issei praised him for his excellent maneuver. The woman looked the boy over and said that if he were not a servant, she would have found another use for him. George corrected Issei, saying that he was not a servant. The guy looked at the woman and said that he was a client in this area. Issei gave George a familiar, appraising look. After this, the girl turned around and told the guy to follow her. At first, George didn't understand what Issei wanted from him. The woman looked at the guy and said that for salvation she would invite him to her chambers. George realized that it was not in vain that he had intervened in this showdown. Meanwhile, Kay was sweeping the courtyard in front of his mistress's chambers. The boy thought that Michio was too conceited to have decided to enter the flower district without a penny to his name. Kay shouted that it was too early for the guy to go after women. The only thing that calmed the boy down was that Michio wouldn't be able to save up enough money for even one courtesan to start talking to him. Kay decided that as a consolation, he would cook the guy something tasty after work. At that moment, Issei approached the chambers and told Kay to prepare everything to receive the visitor. The boy turned to the woman and with a smile on his face replied that he would do everything. Turning around, Kay saw Issei Michio behind him. The boy could not have expected that the lady herself would talk to the guy and even serve him. A couple of minutes later, George entered Issei's chambers and sat down on the pillow opposite the woman. Kay closed the door behind them, wishing them a pleasant stay. The room was silent for a moment as George sipped the tea the boy had brought. Kay stood behind the door and thought that his head was already spinning from all this chaos. Meanwhile, Issei extended her hands forward and invited George to come to her. However, the guy continued drinking tea, not paying attention to such vulgar proposals. Issei bared her legs and said that George could do whatever he wanted with her. Kay was still standing at the door, so he was very embarrassed when he heard the lady's words. The boy immediately ran away from the door, intending to trample somewhere else. George carefully placed the cup on the saucer. After that, he asked Issei if she really wanted to thank him for saving her in this way. The woman replied that entrusting her body for a while to the one who saved her was a mere trifle. Using his crutch, George rose from his seat and walked over to Issa. The guy dropped to one knee next to the woman and looked at her carefully. George gently reached out to Issa's bare legs. The woman looked down, watching the guy's actions. She saw that George did not touch her legs, but only lifted the hem of her kimono. The guy glanced quickly at the woman's legs and then turned away. With a quick movement, George pulled the hem of his kimono up, covering his bare legs. The guy admitted that he lied to Issa because, in fact, he is not a client. George said that the best gratitude he could receive would be answers to his questions. There was silence in the room for a few moments. However, the woman still couldn't hold back and laughed out loud. Issei admitted that she understood from the very beginning that the guy was not a client, but decided to tease him a little. The woman smiled and said that George had passed her test successfully. The guy didn't understand what she was talking about, but Issei hurried him with questions. George looked at the woman doubtfully and asked how she knew he wasn't a client. Issei smiled and said it was hard to miss. The woman tapped her hand with a fan and said that the guy didn't have a bracelet. Issei said that those who officially enter the quarter as clients are given bracelets as proof of the deposit they have made. The absence of a bracelet means that the person entered the area illegally. Issei said that they politely but bluntly send such people back, calling them newbies. Now the guy understood what those looks and words from the courtesans towards him meant. Issei said that to have fun in this place you have to pay a lot of money. The woman pointed to a cash register in the corner and said that the customer puts in a wad of bills as soon as he enters the room. Even while talking to a courtesan, he sucks in one bill every 5 minutes. Money is melting away at a terrifying rate, and the client has to fight this fear. Issei laughed and admitted that even working here, she thinks it's just a crazy system of robbery. George did not share the woman's cheerful mood. The guy said that's why people like the man who attacked her earlier appear. Issei opened her fan and said that George was right. The woman explained that every client starts at the very bottom, with the status of regular, and such people are forbidden from even touching the courtesan with a finger. If a man meets certain conditions, his level is upgraded to privileged. Issei opened the door behind her and said that only by becoming privileged does a man have the right to touch a courtesan. Behind the door there was a room with a bed. George said he was surprised that there were people who paid for it without a single objection. Issei said that male lust has a way of loosening wallets. Suddenly the woman's mood changed and she gathered up her fan. Issei said that was not the only reason for the attacks. The woman was silent for a few moments, biting her lip in anger. George said it was hard to believe that there were people on this island who could afford such sums. The guy asked who comes to this place anyway. Issei replied that almost all of the clients come here from the mainland. George immediately jumped up and suggested that in this case there was a possibility of getting off this island. The guy asked the woman how new clients were transferred here. However, Issei opened her fan again and apologized to George. The woman said that information about movements on the island was top secret, and that disclosing secrets was punishable by beheading. At that moment, George realized that there was no point in questioning Issei. The woman gathered her fan back together and asked if the boy had any more questions. George closed his eyes and thought. Then the guy decided to ask Issa one more question. George looked at the woman and asked if she knew a man named Kenzaki. Issei asked for more information, and the boy said that the man used to be a doctor, but now it is unknown what he does. The woman thought about it, but said it would be difficult to find out anything since real names were rarely used in the neighborhood. George nodded and thanked Issei for her answers. After this, the woman leaned towards the guy and said that now it was her time to ask questions. Issei gently took George's hand and brought it to her face. The woman asked the guy if he wanted to belong to her. George was in no hurry to jump to conclusions and waited for an explanation. After some time, Issei announced that the fight would last 60 seconds. Opposite George stood the man who had previously been supposed to protect Issei on the street, but had been unable to do so. There were also 4 more girls in the room who were watching what was happening. George looked closely at his opponent. Issei waved her fan and ordered them to begin the fight. The enemy began to attack George, but he stood still as if he was not going to respond. The guy was only thinking about how he managed to end up in this situation. Less than an hour ago, Issei proposed to George. The woman wanted the guy to belong to her and her colleagues. George didn't understand what exactly was being discussed. Seeing this, Issei said that she wanted to recruit the boy to be their personal black shirt. George was so surprised he didn't even know what to answer. Before the boy could come to his senses, the woman stood up and told him to follow her. Issei led George down the corridor and then they climbed the stairs to the playroom. Behind the door, the guy discovered something he didn't expect to see. The guy's eyes widened in surprise. The room contained a stylish guest room in a mixed Western-Japanese style, completely unlike the slums. In the city of wet flowers, courtesans live in groups of 5. They lead a communal life in the rooms on the top floor of the playroom. Issei walked into the room and clapped her hands, asking all the girls to gather. At that moment, all 4 girls entered the room. There was a tapestry with the name of Tsubaki's group hanging on the wall. The girl with long, dark blonde hair said her name was Kumika, and the girl with pink hair standing next to her was named Kosuzu. The blonde-haired girl didn't look up from applying makeup and said her name was Pawn. The green-haired, curvaceous courtesan introduced herself as Ron. To maintain order, each group of courtesans could hire only 1 black shirt guard. At that moment, a man burst into the room, clearly worried about something. The man approached Issa and asked why he was being fired. The woman turned to face him and said that they had decided to entrust the job of personal black shirt to George. The guy reminded Issa that he had not yet accepted her proposal. The man immediately fell to his knees and begged her to change her mind, as otherwise she would face the fate of a slave miner. Issei said that she wanted to entrust their protection to a strong man, and all the girls in this room agreed with her. Kosuzu smiled and agreed with Lady Issei. Ron didn't look up from her meal and said she didn't care. Pawn continued to apply makeup, saying that she also didn't care who would guard them. The man was almost in tears and asked the girls to give him another chance. The black shirt pointed at George and said that there was no way they would lose to some ragamuffin. Kumika couldn't help but chuckle. The girl said that it would be worth giving the man a chance to show himself. The black shirt immediately jumped up to George and said that he would smear him across the wall and would not even look at the fact that he was wounded. Issa smiled and suggested a duel to find out which of them was worthy of being their personal guard. And so began the battle for the position of personal black shirt. George didn't try hard to show off his skills because he wasn't required to. The guy easily dodged the man's blows, even despite his injured leg. The man was confused and said that George was just lucky to dodge his blow. The guy, in turn, only looked skeptically at all the man's attempts to reach him. The enemy believed that he could easily defeat the wounded man. However, George was not so simple. His movements were light and smooth, but allowed him to dodge in time. The black shirt kept advancing, but he couldn't reach the boy. Former military man George Sai doesn't like to use unnecessary force. That is why he is in no hurry to attack the enemy. The guy waits for the moment when his opponent gets exhausted from his own attacks and gives up. The black shirt tried to strike faster, but it didn't help him. The man decided to try to get George angry and started teasing him about how he was afraid to say anything. However, even if it is an unfair fight, George's principles remain the same. The guy thought that if he became a black shirt, he would be able to live legally in this city. George decided that there was quite a lot of benefit in this. The guy decided that it was time to end this fight. As the black shirt raised his hand again to strike, George let go of the crutch. The man thought that the boy had stumbled and dropped his support, so he quickly approached. However, George did this on purpose and was already preparing to strike. The guy delivered one precise blow to the opponent's jaw, knocking out his teeth. In times of need, George Sai knows no mercy. Kosuzu and Kumika exclaimed in surprise. Pawn finally looked up from her makeup when she saw something worthy of her attention. Ron couldn't believe that the wounded boy was able to defeat their former black shirt with one blow. Issei expected this outcome of the fight, so she only smiled. The woman took the guy by the hand and raised it up, appointing him the winner. The girls were amazed at how strong the guy turned out to be. After some time, the girls gave George his new uniform. The guy put on a black shirt suit and said it was uncomfortable to move in. Kumika laughed at this remark and approached George from behind. The girl straightened the guy's tie, saying that it was crooked. The girl said in a soft voice that the guy was cool in battle. Kumika's whole appearance suggested that she was flirting with the guy. The girl turned away and said that there were few customers today. Kumika suggested to George that they throw a welcoming party, but just the two of them. The guy immediately understood what exactly the girl was talking about. Sometime later, the girls decided to celebrate the appearance of a new black shirt. The courtesans ate and drank with George, but Kumika sat on the sofa, separate from everyone else. Issei noticed that the guy didn't drink alcohol and asked why, to which George said that alcohol was poison. Pon looked at Kumika, who was sitting separately, and asked what she was offended about. The girl said sadly that it was supposed to be a party for two. Pon laughed and said that even if George was handsome, love between black shirts and courtesans was forbidden. Kumika turned to them and said that it was not about love at all. The girl said that when she sees a strong man, her uterus goes crazy. At this point, Ron joined the conversation, slamming her glass on the table. The girl warned that if they started an affair, she would report it to the appropriate authorities. Ron said she wouldn't feel sorry for them because she would get points for it, while George checked the food for poison. Kosuzu asked her not to say such horrors, to which Ron replied that such were the rules in this place. Pon asked Ron how many points they could get for reporting an affair between a courtesan and a black shirt. As if preparing for this question, Ron took out a piece of paper with the rules written on it. Having found the right line, the girl said that she would be given as many as 20 points for it. Pon thanked Kumika for the opportunity, but the girl immediately said that she was not going to date George. Ron had already begun to dream about how she could use these points to rise to the most elite level. Seeing the confusion on George's face, Issei decided to tell the boy about the courtesan ranking system. The woman said that Ron, Pon, and Kosuzu were of the rank of Usugumi, which meant low-ranking courtesans. Issei and Kumika themselves are of the Oboro Kagetsu rank, meaning they are one level higher. Kosuzu sat closer to George and said that Issei had almost reached the level of the high courtesans. Issei sighed and said that she wasn't looking forward to it at all, but Kumika started to support her. George noted that both the clients and the courtesans and everything else, this city is built on ranks. Issei said that the Wet Flower Quarter is a society of total hierarchy. From the girls' conversation, the guy suggested that denunciation was one of the ways to raise one's rank. Issei said that this is one way, since usually courtesans get points for sales. She personally never denounced anyone, but there are courtesans who try to rise solely by denunciation. George was intrigued and decided to look into the situation in more detail. The boy approached Ron, who was eating and reading a sheet of rules. George needed to know what could lead him to a bad end. He snatched the paper from the girl, causing the food to fly out of her hands. Ron was more concerned about her food, so she rushed to catch it first. The girl began to scold the guy for his behavior, but he did not pay attention to her. One of the rules was a ban on crossing the gates of the block. George asked if they really weren't allowed to leave the block. Issei confirmed that this ban applied to both courtesans and black shirts. The woman said that the only way to leave the area was in the event of death. Ron and Pon were completely satisfied with these conditions, because they were given everything they needed and even more. Pon was most pleased with the cosmetics that were given to her for free, she only had to ask. Ron was most captivated by the delicious food that they were not limited to. There were indeed many delicacies on the table. The girl said it was a real paradise. However, neither Issei nor George agreed with this. The guy thought that all this was more like a prison. Ron was already drunk from the amount of alcohol she had drunk and called for an assistant. Kei immediately ran into the room and asked what was required of him. The girls immediately said what other drinks they should bring. George became wary and said that the boy had been both inside and outside the block today. Issei replied that servants could go out as an exception. The woman said that she would tell him all the details later, but now he should eat, since this party was in his honor. Kei was confused by the fact that Mrs. Issei was talking to the boy on equal terms. Having carried out all the courtesan's orders, the boy went out into the servants' room. Kei said sadly that Michio seemed to have become a person from a completely different world. At that moment, the boy's stomach began to rumble with hunger, and he said that he was terribly hungry. Kei dreamed of finishing Mrs. Issei's meal someday. At that moment, a woman who was a servant appeared and said that this would never happen. The old woman said that the leftovers are then sold to the slums, and if they touch even a crumb from the table, they will be immediately thrown out. Kei started shouting that he just said it and didn't intend to do it. The old woman's quarrel with the boy was interrupted by George, who entered the servants' room and asked if they wanted something to eat. Kay immediately ran up to the guy and asked what he was doing there. Instead of answering, George opened the lid of the boxes and showed a lot of different food from the courtesan's table. Kay's mouth immediately started to water, and he asked why the guy brought it. As soon as the boy took a piece of food, the old woman reminded him that he couldn't eat it. She reminded Kay that George could snitch on them and get points. The boy immediately became frightened and put the food back. George already knew that servants were not allowed to eat food from the courtesans' tables, so he understood their reaction. The guy said that he was not interested in either denunciations or points. George said that he would need their help in the future. The guy brought them food as an advance payment for the service. Kay was confused because he wanted to believe that his friend did not wish him harm. The next day, Kay had to pay George for the food. The boy walked for a long time in an unknown direction, dragging a heavy cart behind him. However, soon he saw what the boy had told him about. On the outskirts of the island, there was a house, next to which a girl with dark hair was hanging out sheets. Kay waved his hand and shouted, attracting attention. The girl turned towards the boy and looked at him with confusion. Kay ran closer and asked the girl's name to make sure that she was the one he was looking for. After some time, the boy told Rina how George had managed to get into the neighborhood. To ensure that no one could overhear them, the girl invited Kay to her house. Rina poured them each a glass of clean water and placed one in front of the boy. Kay was very surprised, as he had never seen such clear water anywhere except in the flower district. Rina asked the boy if he knew that dirty water was not safe to drink and offered to teach him how to distill water. Kay became interested in this, and the girl explained that the water should be boiled and then only the clean condensate should be collected. Soon, Rini changed the subject and asked if Michio was okay. Kay chuckled and said that the guy was able to become a personal blackshirt on the very first day. Rina breathed a sigh of relief and said that in that case, everything was fine. Suddenly, Kay remembered the reason why he was looking for the girl. The boy took out an envelope and put it on the table, saying that Michio had ordered him to deliver it. The girl immediately took the envelope and opened it. The guy wrote that Rini should describe Kenzaki's appearance and any guesses related to him in more detail. Meanwhile, Kay quietly crept behind the girl and read the letter, causing Rina to shudder. The boy said that he could personally convey all the information to Michio, but if there was too much of it, it would be better for the girl to write it all down. Rina frowned and put the letter back into the envelope. The girl said that she couldn't rely on Kay, and this hurt him. The boy immediately asked why Rina was treating him like that. The girl replied that the area was so closed that if anyone found out that Kay was connected with people outside, they would definitely kill him. However, the boy seemed not to understand the full danger and insisted on helping. Rina couldn't take it anymore and started screaming, asking if Kay really didn't understand that he would be killed for this. The boy took a couple of steps back from such pressure. We are transported to the moment when George entered the servants' room to hand them food. The boy then handed Kay the food and asked him to give the envelope to a doctor named Rini. The boy didn't really listen and snatched the envelope, saying that he would do everything. Kay immediately sat down on the floor and began to quickly eat the food he had brought. The old maid immediately ran up to him and started shouting again that he couldn't eat it. George knelt down beside them and handed the old woman the box, calling it a reward for her silence. The guy said that he would hope that she could be trusted with secrets. The old woman opened the box and saw the same food as Kay's. For a few moments, the servant considered whether she should break the rules. However, after just a few seconds, she couldn't take it anymore. The old woman furiously attacked the food and thanked the guy. Kay watched in amazement as the woman ate quickly, tears streaming endlessly from her eyes. The boy was now calm and continued eating slowly with a slight smile on his face. We go back to the moment when Rina yelled at Kay. The boy remembered the kindness Michio had shown him, so he couldn't leave it like that. Kay jokingly said that the guy had lied to him from the very beginning. These words caught Rina's attention and she turned to face him. Kay said that Michio initially told him with a calm expression that he had come to the neighborhood to buy a woman. The boy admitted that at that moment he almost hated the guy. However, Kay then realized that Michio came to the flower district to help people. The boy said that this is why he wants to help the guy with all his heart. Rina looked at Kay in surprise and didn't know what to answer him. The boy came closer and admitted that without his help, Michio would not be able to do anything anyway. Rina said that the guy was always frowning and acting so important. After that, they laughed, and Kay said that Michio has been playing the role of a cold type lately. The boy slapped his chest and said that Rina could trust him and he would not let her down. It seemed that the girl had now calmed down and was ready to trust Kay. Rina said that Kenzaki is most likely using a different name now. The girl also suggested that the man could even change his appearance. Rina said the person she knew might look completely different now. Kei said that in that case, it would be impossible to find him. A little later, Rina added that Kenzaki had one peculiarity. The girl was convinced that no matter how hard he tried, the man would not be able to hide it. We returned to the Nuraha quarter, where George began working as a personal blackshirt. The guy kept a close eye on the clients who came to this place from the mainland. George understood that there was an entrance and an exit to this island. After a while, the door to Issei's room opened and she asked how the situation was outside. The woman said that everything was calm now, so George shouldn't worry so much. The boy replied that he couldn't relax because he was on a mission, and these words made Issei laugh. George said he chose a rather leisurely time to start work. Issei replied that everything was quiet here in the morning, since the real work in the nightclubs began in the evening. The woman looked towards the rest of her colleagues' rooms and said that Kosuzu had already opened early in the morning. Issei said that it was mainly the courtesans who were on the verge of the rank of Usubeni who worked in the morning. At that moment, Kosuzu saw a familiar man and called him. The girl jumped up and invited him to come to her, since she was free now. However, the man nodded to her easily and replied that he could not do this now and promised to come another time. Kosuzu winced at the refusal she received. George looked at her and told Issa that the girl had her own plan. The woman replied that someday the guy would be able to understand all the tricks of the courtesans. After this, Issei approached George and whispered in his ear whether Kei liked yesterday's leftovers. The guy pretended not to understand anything, but the woman said that she had long ago figured out that he was up to something. Issei asked what picture George was painting in his head. The guy looked sternly at the woman and told her not to make unfounded accusations. Issei smiled and didn't insist. The woman said that she would not report the guy. Before going to her room, Issei said that George would be in debt. The guy didn't deny it and asked what the woman wanted. Issei said that when the time came, George would simply have to take her side. Now the guy realized that the woman was also playing her own secret game. When Issei was about to leave, someone called her. George saw a man walking purposefully towards Issei. The old man smiled kindly and asked how she was doing, and a dark-haired boy walked next to him. The man asked if Issei was taking care of her health. The old man hoped that nothing was bothering the woman. Issei smiled and walked up to the old man, calling him Dr. Muroi and saying that he was bombarding her with questions as always. The doctor replied that all the women in the Nureka quarter were his dear patients, and that was why he was worried about them. That is why a man always strives to find out whether a girl is healthy in body and soul. The doctor noticed George and said he had never seen him before, and Issei hastened to introduce him. The woman said that this guy is now the personal blackshirt of Tsubaki's group. Issei said that Dr. Muroi often comes to perform regular medical examinations on the courtesans. At that moment, the woman realized that the time for the next medical examination had not yet come. Muroi said he was informed that the chairman was feeling ill, so he came for a checkup. Issei smiled and said she would hope the chairman was okay. The doctor replied that the man was cheerful and fresh, and surprisingly resilient for his age. But something caught Muroi's attention. The man approached George and asked why he needed the homemade crutch. The guy replied that he had cut himself a little and didn't want to bother his leg. The man said that this was very bad, because if the wound became infected, the leg would have to be amputated. Muroi insisted on conducting an inspection, but George refused. The doctor sat down next to the boy and said that one shouldn't take wounds so lightly. Muroi grabbed the boy by the leg and said that he should at least disinfect the wound. George didn't like the fact that the doctor didn't listen to him. The boy hit Muroi's hand with his crutch, causing the man to jerk strangely. The doctor's hand flew off at that moment, separating from his body. George winced, his attention caught on that moment. Issei was frightened by the guy's behavior. Some time ago, Kei learned the details of Kenzaki's description from Rina. The girl said that the man had a prosthesis. Kei understood that this was the main clue that Michio could rely on. Rin explained that Kenzaki is missing his left arm below the elbow, so he wears an artificial arm. The girl said that the man was a master of his craft, so changing his appearance would not be difficult. However, he cannot restore the lost limb. This was Kenzaki's main distinguishing feature. At the moment, George was able to find a man with a prosthetic left arm. The boy accompanying Dr. Muroi seemed to be angry. Issei tried to smooth things over, but the boy had already rushed past her. George instantly noticed the approaching danger. The boy's eyes lit up and he reached for his katana. The guy drew his sword and was about to deliver the fatal blow. However, George reacted in time and blocked the blow with his crutch. The boy was significantly smaller than the guy, but his skills were amazing. Issei was afraid to interfere in this situation in any way. George's hand shook with tension, but he kept his eyes on the boy. The boy, in turn, watched the guy closely, but his gaze seemed lifeless. Suddenly, Dr. Muroi's cry was heard, ordering Roku to stop. The boy reacted immediately and turned away from George, putting away his katana. In an instant, Roku was next to the doctor. Muroi admitted that the boy's upbringing was poor. The doctor picked up his prosthesis and apologized for Roku's behavior. The man also apologized for intending to begin treatment without permission. Muroi said deep wounds are easy to make mistakes with, and improper treatment often leads to necrosis. The man said it was just an old man's anxiety. The doctor reattached the prosthesis and noted that it would be truly inconvenient to be without an arm or leg. George watched the man's behavior carefully and said nothing. Muroi turned to Roku and said that he did not approve of such behavior. The boy bowed and apologized, but the man said that he was not the one he should apologize to. Roku immediately understood what was being discussed and did not show a drop of indignation. Under Issei's surprised gaze, the boy turned to George, bowed and apologized for his thoughtless behavior. Roku looked at the boy with lifeless eyes and apologized for almost taking his life. George flinched under that cold gaze. Dr. Muroi approached Issa and apologized to her for what happened. The woman accepted the apology, after which Muroi went on about his business, along with Roku. After this, Issei approached George and asked him with concern if everything was okay. The guy easily replied that he was fine. However, George still noticed his crutch, which had taken Rock's blow. The guy saw that the blow was so strong that it almost cut down the tree. When it was deep into the night, George climbed onto the roof of the house and sat in the lotus position. The guy seemed to be immersed in meditation. He imagined himself on an empty street with Roku. The skirmish that had happened earlier did not give him any peace. George looked closely into the boy's eyes, trying to find something there. However, the boy's gaze expressed nothing. George took a step forward, but Roku didn't react in any way. After this, the guy threw away the crutch and rushed towards the boy. The boy struck but missed, as if he had caught Roku's shadow. A moment later, the boy was behind George and drawing his katana. The guy sharply bowed his head and blocked the blow with his hand. Roku immediately jumped to the side. However, the very next moment, the boy rushed into the attack again. Roku seemed unable to see any attacks other than those aimed at the opponent's neck. George was dodging the attack and accidentally leaned on his sore leg. At that moment, pain cut through him and he became distracted. This turned out to be a fatal mistake, because Roku noticed this and approached him from behind. George noticed this, but did not have time to react. Roku looked at him with cold eyes and said that it was too late. George was angry, but there was nothing he could do. With one precise move, Roku chopped off his head. At that moment, George emerged from his meditation. No matter how many times the boy replayed his fight with Roku in his head, the boy usually always won. Former military man George Say calculated all possible attack and defense options. He repeated the simulations in such numbers that they could truly be called countless. Considering that one of his legs was not in perfect condition, he estimated his own capabilities at about 40% of the norm. Deliberately lowering the bar, he replayed the battles in his head over and over again. Constant repetitions of various combinations of movements and events flashed through his head. This time, George lost again and again, and there was nothing he could do about it. These simulations developed his combat thinking and were what was known as George's combat IQ. However, this time everything was completely different. George had never encountered a situation where the probability of winning in simulations dropped below 10%. Judging by his appearance, Rock was only about 12 years old. George couldn't believe that such speed was even possible at that age. The guy was distracted from his thoughts by Kay's voice. The boy climbed onto the roof to talk to George. After some time, the guy learned that the man he was looking for walked with a prosthesis. George said Kenzaki was identified surprisingly quickly. Besides this, the guy was given the opportunity for a real fight. Kay saw that George was very thoughtful today, so he asked what was the matter. The guy chuckled and said that thanks to Kay, he was able to quickly identify the target. The boy was very happy with the praise. Kay jumped to his feet and started clapping George on the shoulder, telling him it was nothing. After a while, they went down to the house, and the guy asked Kay to keep what they had talked about today a secret. The closer they got to the main room, the louder the crying became. George became alert and went into the room to find out what had happened. When he entered, the guy saw Kosuzu crying and Kumika comforting her. The girl still couldn't calm down and her friend's persuasion didn't help. George was wary. but decided to wait until they decided to tell him everything.